Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, Silent Frames Behind the Wallpaper. I had never been late to my night shift before. The security guard job at the municipal parking garage was hardly glamorous, but it paid enough to keep me afloat while I finished my degree. That Tuesday, though, I left the house later than usual, distracted by a call from my mom about my grandmother who had been feeling under the weather. The sun was already a dull orange smear behind the line of pines as I drove down the winding stretch of the county road toward the city. The forest on either side of the road closed in tight, bare enough in early spring to make the dark trunks stand out like black fingers clutching the edge of the road. I pulled into the lot at 8:15 p.m., 15 minutes past the usual start time. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered weakly, buzzing in the heavy, stale air of the garage. The concrete floor smelled faintly of oil and damp. I locked the driver's side door behind me and headed up the stairwell to the small security office on the third level. The circle of light from the single desk lamp didn't quite reach the edges of the room, leaving shadows pooled in the corners. I flipped on the monitors one by one, scanning the grainy black and white feeds from the cameras. Empty. The space was usually a little busier on weeknights, especially this late, with commuters coming in late or leaving early shifts. But tonight it was just me and the hum of the ventilation system. I settled into the worn-out chair, rubbing my hands together to chase away the chill, and pulled out my phone to check messages. No new texts, save for a notification from my mom about my grandmother's meds. About 20 minutes into my shift, a faint noise caught my attention, footsteps echoing softly from the stairwell below. I looked up, but the cameras on that level showed no one. Maybe maintenance, I thought. They were supposed to be doing some work on the elevators tonight. I made a mental note to check the stairwell during my break. Time passed slowly, the silence pressing against my ears like a weight. I tried to distract myself by checking the monitors again, but the faint footsteps returned this time from the far end of the garage, near the exit ramp. The camera showed nothing. No movement. No cars, nothing. I frowned, leaning forward to adjust the camera angle, but the image stayed stubbornly still. My heart ticked up a notch when I heard a low scraping noise, like metal against concrete, coming from the exit. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk, flicked it on, and headed up the office door, moving cautiously toward the stairwell that led down to the exit floor. The air was colder down there, damp and heavy with the smell of mildew. I swept the beam over the concrete walls and the rows of empty parking spots. Nothing. But then I noticed something on the ground near the exit door, a small, jagged piece of metal, maybe from a broken tool or a car part. The scraping must have come from that. I pocketed the shard and pushed open the door to the outside. The night was dark and quiet, a soft wind stirring the leafless branches of the trees lining the street lamplit sidewalk. No cars, no people. I locked the door behind me and walked quickly back inside, the echo of my own footsteps sounding unnervingly loud in the hollow space. Back at the office, I tried to settle back into my chair, but the unease clung to me. I checked the cameras again, eyes darting from screen to screen. That's when I noticed it, a figure, barely visible on the farthest camera, standing just outside the garage entrance, at the edge of the streetlight's glow. I zoomed in as much as the system would let me. The person wasn't moving, just standing there, looking directly at the camera, or at least, in its direction. I blinked, thinking maybe it was a trick of the grainy image. The figure was too still, too deliberate. I felt a cold prickle tracing down my spine. I called the front desk of the building above the garage to ask if anyone forgotten keys or if there was after-hours access. The woman on the line said no one should be there, and the building was locked tight. The figure was still there when I checked again 20 minutes later. Then, suddenly, it was gone. I told myself it was someone who got spooked and left. Maybe a homeless person looking for shelter, or a late-night jogger. Still, I kept the flashlight close and the desk phone at arm's reach. Around midnight, a crackling on the radio scanner I kept for emergencies made me jump. It was static at first, then a barely audible voice saying, "I see you." I froze, heart thudding in my chest. The voice was low, calm, but with a quiet menace, no background noise, no hint of where it was coming from. "Hello?" I whispered into the radio, but there was no reply. Just static. For the next hour, I kept glancing out the small window near my desk. The parking lot was still empty, but my nerves were raw. The tension built with every passing minute, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios, a stalker, a desperate criminal casing the place, or someone with no intention of being found. Then the emergency exit door, the one I had locked hours ago, creaked open slightly. A sliver of cold air slipped into the office, carrying the faint scent of cigarette smoke and damp earth. I grabbed the flashlight and the heavy metal baton from under the desk, hands trembling. I stepped outside into the hallway, heart hammering, and called the police on my cell. My voice was tight as I explained the situation, the open door, the figure outside. The dispatcher assured me officers were en route but warned me to stay inside and keep the doors locked. I swallowed hard and returned to the office, securing the door behind me. The silence pressed in again, heavier this time. I crouched behind the desk, flashlight and baton ready, waiting for the first sounds of officers arriving. Minutes stretched thin, each one longer than the last. Then, from the stairwell, came the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps ascending, closer, unmistakable. I held my breath. The diner was nearly empty, the kind of place where the walls felt like they'd soaked up decades of cigarette smoke and quiet desperation. I sat in a vinyl booth, the cracked red seat stiff beneath me, stirring my coffee absent-mindedly with a cheap plastic stirrer. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the near silence, and outside the rain slapped raggedly against the windows, casting everything inside in a dull gray haze. I had just pulled off the highway, needing a break from the monotonous stretch of road and the gnawing feeling that I was being watched. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was the paranoia kicking in. I glanced at my phone again. No service. The little icon in the corner was blank, mocking me. I tried to tell myself it was just a location, this stretch of nowhere between towns always had terrible reception. But the weird thing was, just 15 minutes earlier, I'd answered a call from an unknown number and heard nothing but heavy breathing on the other end before it cut out. At first, I thought it was a wrong number, or maybe some prank. But the breath had sounded deliberate, slow, and calculated. It wasn't accidental background noise. It had made my skin crawl, and I'd ended the call without a word. The waitress approached, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a faded name tag that read March. She moved with the slow, mechanical grace of someone who'd been doing this job too long, and she set a cup of black coffee down in front of me without a word. Her gaze lingered for a second, the kind of look that felt like she knew something I didn't. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile. "Any chance you got reception closer to the highway? My phone's dead out here." She shrugged, her expression unreadable. "Nothing much out there but trees and old satellite dishes. You might get a bar or two if you head back the way you came." I nodded, swirling the hot coffee. The bitter smell filled my nostrils, momentarily grounding me. Then, without really thinking, I asked, "Has anyone else been around here? Strange people, or—" She cut me off with a tight smile. "This town's slow. People mostly keep to themselves. But if you're feeling watched, maybe you should just get back on the road." Her words felt like a warning. I swallowed hard, fighting the sudden urge to get out of this place. I paid the bill and stepped outside, the rain having eased into a steady drizzle that slicked the parking lot with a greasy sheen. I walked to my car, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the wet asphalt. When I reached the driver's side door, I froze. There, etched into the grime just below the handle, was a message scratched roughly into the dirt: "I see you." My throat tightened. I'd cleaned the car just 2 days before. This was new. Heart hammering, I scanned the perimeter. The parking lot was deserted except for a beat-up pickup truck parked halfway down the row. Its engine was off, but the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. A chill crept down my spine as I wondered if whoever wrote the message was still nearby. I locked the doors and slid into the driver's seat, hands trembling slightly as I started the engine. The road back to the highway was narrow and winding, flanked by dense woods that seemed to close in around the single lane like dark teeth. The headlights threw long, jittery shadows that shifted with every bend. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but there was no sign of the truck. Maybe it had left while I was inside the diner. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. It was like the woods themselves were watching, or worse, like someone was hiding just beyond the tree line. I blinked hard, trying to dispel the images, but the unease only grew. Halfway back to the highway, I spotted headlights flashing in the rearview mirror, a pair of bright beams cutting through the mist like twin searchlights. The truck was back, and it was following me. My pulse doubled. I tapped the brakes lightly to see if it would pass, but the truck matched my speed, tailing me too closely to be comfortable. I took a deep breath and turned off onto a side road I hadn't noticed before, hoping to lose it in the maze of rural lanes. The road was narrower here, lined with tall pines that blocked out the scant moonlight. The truck slowed, then disappeared from the mirror. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I stopped the car, the engine ticking as it cooled. The silence felt oppressive. That's when I saw the figure standing by the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline of a person watching. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly I thought they might cramp. Then, without moving, the figure raised a hand and waved at me. Not a friendly wave, more like a deliberate signal. My stomach turned over. I locked the doors again, my eyes darting around, but the figure was gone when I blinked. I started the car and sped back toward the highway, not daring to stop until I reached the next town. When I finally pulled into a gas station, I was trembling so badly the attendant gave me a concerned look. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just got a little lost." Inside, I charged my phone and checked the messages. There was a text from an unknown number: "Don't leave. We need to talk." I didn't respond. I didn't know who he was or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for certain: I was already in deeper than I'd imagined. And whoever was doing this wasn't just a random stranger. They were watching, waiting. And now, I had no idea how to get away. I'd never cared much about jogging, but that morning I convinced myself it was the only way to clear my head. The air was crisp, with that faint early summer smell of wet asphalt and fresh-cut grass mingling in the cool breeze. The neighborhood was quiet except for the occasional chirp of a robin and the distant hum of a lawnmower down the street. I stayed on the cracked sidewalk, passing the same few houses I'd seen every day for years, their windows catching the weak sunlight like dull mirrors. I didn't notice him at first. He was walking the other way, a few blocks ahead, dressed in a thin black hoodie with the hood up despite the warm sun. His gait was slow but steady, arms swinging loosely. When our eyes met briefly, I caught a glimpse of his face, pale, angular, and just off enough that it made me blink twice. He said nothing, only a brief nod before turning his head away. That small, almost polite gesture was the first thing that unsettled me. People on my street didn't nod at strangers during morning jogs. I tried to shake it off and picked up my pace, deciding to run a little farther than usual. The route curved into a quieter residential area, where the houses were spaced wider apart, and the sidewalks had more cracks, with weeds poking through like nature's stubborn reminders. The sun was higher now, making shadows from overhanging trees sprawl across the pavement like ink blots. That's when I heard the footsteps. They started faint but unmistakable, matching my rhythm. I looked over my shoulder and saw him again, the same man in the hoodie, now a few yards behind, moving at my pace. My heart jumped, but I told myself maybe he was just out for a walk or a jog of his own. Still, I twisted my neck to look again. His face was obscured by the hood, but I noticed the way his head tilted slightly, as if studying me. I sped up. The pounding of my shoes on the sidewalk became louder, and the footsteps behind mirrored my every stride. I glanced back once more. He was definitely following. My breath started coming in short bursts, and the calm morning dulled into a thick unease that settled low in my stomach. I cut down a side street, hoping to lose him among the houses, but the space was narrow and enclosed. 2 rows of fences, peeling paint, and overgrown hedges that scratched at my arms as I passed. The man kept pace, neither speeding up nor slowing down, just steady. His silence felt deliberate, like a predator stalking prey and testing its boundaries. Ahead, a gate at the end of the alley stood open. I ducked through it, pushing myself harder, muscles burning with the effort to break away from this shadow. The backyard I entered was bland, patchy grass, a rusted swing set, a broken birdbath. The fence on the far side was low enough to climb, and I scrambled over, scraping my palms on the weathered wood. I landed roughly on the other side, heart hammering so loud I was sure it would give me away. The quiet behind me was thick, and I dared to peek back. The man was there, standing at the edge of the alley, staring where I disappeared. For a moment, it looked like he might call after me, but he didn't. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, gasping for air, my chest tight and trembling. I slowed to a walk, trying to steady myself, scanning the sidewalk. There was no sign of him. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but my phone was dead. I'd left it charging on the kitchen counter in my apartment. The thought of going back there made my stomach churn. What if he had seen where I lived? I forced myself to think logically. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was a jogger like me, just out early. But the way he matched my pace exactly, the way he watched me, it wasn't normal. I decided to cut across the small park nearby, a place I usually avoided because it felt deserted. The grass was damp with morning dew, and the swings creaked softly in the breeze. I stuck to the paved path, ears straining for any sound that might betray someone trailing me. Halfway through, I felt the unmistakable prickling sensation on the back of my neck that told me I was being watched. My eyes darted around, catching sight of a figure slipping behind a cluster of trees. My heart thudded again, this time with a surge of panic. I broke into a run, pushing my legs harder, refusing to let the fear stop me. The park ended at a busy street where the cafe was just opening. The smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls was oddly comforting, a stark contrast to the tension gnawing inside me. I crossed the street and ducked inside, immediately spotting the barista, a woman I'd never spoken to but recognized from the neighborhood. I ordered a coffee, my hands shaking as I dug through my pocket for change. She gave me a small smile, like noticing something was off but not pressing. As I waited, I glanced out the window. The street was empty except for a man sitting on the bench across the road. He wore a hoodie, black, like before, pulled low over his face. His hands rested on his knees, and his head was down, but I knew it was him. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I realized he had followed me all the way here. There was no way he hadn't. The busier street meant a lower chance of confrontation, but the fact that he'd come this far was chilling. I wanted to leave, but my legs felt frozen. The barista handed me my coffee, and I tried to make a joke about being late for work, but the words caught in my throat. I pulled out my phone to check the time and saw a single text from an unknown number. "Nice run." The screen went dead. Battery drained. No way. I had charged it last night. I looked back up. The man was gone. The barista asked if I was okay. I nodded, forcing a shaky smile. "Just forgot to charge my phone," I said. She nodded, her eyes flickering with concern. I stepped outside, clutching the coffee like a shield. The street was quiet again. The bench was empty. But the hoodie was still there in the shadow of the alley across the road, just waiting. The late afternoon sun was dipping low, casting long shadows down the cracked pavement as I locked up the grocery store. The bell above the door jingled faintly when I turned the key the last time, then the place was silent save for the hum of the freezer units inside. I shuffled my bags to the passenger seat of my car, the plastic struggling against the weight of canned beans and bottles of water. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. The drive home, usually a 10-minute route along the 2-lane highway that cut through acres of farmland, felt different that day. Maybe it was the way the sky was bruised purple and orange, or the way the horizon seemed too empty, too still. I flipped on the radio, trying to fill the silence with something normal, but the signal crackled and sputtered. Static took over after a moment, then a DJ's voice came through, distant and tinny, announcing the evening news. Police caution residents after a recent string of break-ins in the area. Authorities urge anyone who sees suspicious activity to report it immediately. I eased the volume down, staring out the windshield at the long stretch of road ahead. The familiar fields looked less friendly under the fading light. I thought about the stories floating around town, people getting followed on their way home, strange noises outside at night, the local gas station clerk who swore someone had been watching him through the window last week. I'd shrugged it off before, but now, with the words fresh in my mind, I felt a ripple of unease. About halfway home, I noticed a dark sedan trailing me. At first, I thought it was just another car, but it stayed behind, keeping the same distance no matter how I adjusted my speed. The license plate was obscured by dirt, and the windows were tinted so heavily I couldn't see anyone inside. I checked the rearview mirror, feeling my pulse quicken. I tried to shake it off, told myself it could be anyone, maybe someone taking the same route. The road was narrow, and turns were few. I took a sharp right onto an unpaved back road, hoping to lose whatever was behind me. The gravel crunched under my tires, and the sedan followed, its headlights dull in the dimming light. The branches of overhanging trees scraped against the sides of the car, and I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence, nothing to worry about. But when I stopped at the end of the road, a small clearing surrounded by dense woods, the sedan pulled up behind me and idled. The engine's low rumble mixed with the chirping of cicadas and the occasional rustle of leaves. I sat frozen, hands gripping the steering wheel, breath shallow. I could see the outline of a man in the passenger seat, just out of clear sight, but enough to know he was watching. I unlocked the car, forced myself to get out, and walked toward the edge of the clearing. The man's figure became clearer, tall, wearing a dark jacket, hands resting on his lap. He didn't move or say anything. The windows stayed rolled up. "Can I help you?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I took a step back. The streetlight flickered overhead, casting uneven light that made everything seem sharper, more unreal. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I fumbled it out, glanced at the screen, a message from my sister. "Are you almost home?" I quickly typed back, "Yeah. Running late." The man's head turned slightly, as if he'd noticed the light from my phone. My heart pounded harder. I didn't want to be out here anymore, not with him watching. Without another word, I climbed back into my car and locked the doors. The sedan didn't follow and I drove away. When I pulled into my driveway, the street was empty and quiet again. I sat in the car for a moment, hands still trembling, before gathering my groceries and hurrying inside. I locked the door behind me, double-checked the windows, the deadbolt. Everything was as I'd left it, but the air inside felt colder, heavier. The rest of the night was a blur of checking locks and listening for sounds in the dark. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside made me jump. My phone buzzed again, a message from an unknown number. "Nice place you have." I stared at the screen, numb. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been watching me, waiting to make sure I got home. I thought about calling the police, but what could I say? A shadowy car on a back road? A vague threat in a text? I felt trapped, exposed. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the window in the living room, a baseball bat resting on my lap, eyes fixed on the street. The quiet stretched on, but the sense of being hunted lingered, like a cold weight pressing down on my chest. When dawn finally broke, I forced myself to get up, make coffee, and pretend everything was normal. But I knew, deep down, this was only the beginning. Whoever that was, whoever sat silently in the dark, watching and waiting, was still out there. And now, so was my fear. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves, but every creak in the house, every shadow shifting at the edge of my vision, pulled me back into that suffocating dread. I wasn't alone. Not by a long shot. I had never minded working the night shift at the lakeside bait shop. It was usually quiet, sometimes dull, but quiet. The only time I really felt on edge was during bad weather, thick fog rolling over the water, rain drumming on the old wooden roof, the occasional distant crash of thunder. But that Monday night was clear and still, the stars sharp in the sky, the moon bright enough to cast long, dark shadows from the trees lining the dirt road. I arrived just after 10, parking my old car by the rusty sign that always creaked in the wind. The place looked the same as always, peeling paint on the windowsill, the faded open sign flickering weakly. It smelled of stale coffee and the faint, sour tang of old worms in plastic containers. I switched on the lights inside, checked the cash register, and settled into the uncomfortable stool behind the counter. At first, the night passed in silence except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Then, around midnight, a pickup truck rolled down the gravel road. I noticed the headlights through the front window, a low rumble settling in the air. The truck pulled up, dust rising behind it, and a man stepped out. He was wearing a dark hoodie, the hood pulled low over his forehead, shadowing his face. I caught only a glimpse, a strong jawline, a thin scar near his left eye. He came inside without saying a word, his boots thudding softly on the worn wooden floor. I looked up from restocking the fishing lures, forcing a polite smile. "Evening. What can I get you?" He stood still for a moment, hands shoved deep into his pockets. Then he said, voice low and rough, "Got any live minnows?" I pointed to the small tanks by the counter. "Right over there." He nodded, stepping closer. As he reached in to grab a container, I noticed the slight tremble in his hands. Not the usual shaky jitter from cold, something else, like nervous energy coiled tight beneath his skin. He glanced around the shop, eyes darting quickly but never settling anywhere for long. "Are you from around here?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He shrugged. "Not exactly. Just passing through." The words felt hollow, like a script he'd used before. I studied him a moment more, the way his hoodie hung loose, the faint smell of cigarettes mixed with something metallic, maybe sweat or motor oil. I returned to the counter, watching as he picked up a couple more containers of bait. The silence stretched, thickening the air between us. Then he said, "You close in an hour?" I nodded. "Yeah, usually by 1. He grunted, glanced out the window toward the dark woods lining the lake. "You ever hear noises out there at night?" I shrugged. "Sometimes. Probably raccoons or something." He didn't respond, just shifted his weight and looked back at me. "Funny thing," he said, voice dropping lower, "I've been hearing footsteps behind me the last few nights. Like someone's watching." I forced a chuckle, but it felt hollow. "Out here? Maybe it's just the wind. This place plays tricks on you." He gave a half smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, maybe." For a while, we just stood there, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I kept watching him, the way he kept glancing at the door, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the bait containers. Then my phone buzzed quietly on the counter. I glanced at the screen, a text from my sister, a bad joke she sent to lighten the mood. I smiled without much enthusiasm and typed a quick reply. The man's eyes flicked to the phone. "You got someone checking on you?" he asked, voice softer now. I hesitated. "Family. They worry sometimes." He nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled pack of cigarettes. "Mind if I have one?" I shook my head. "Go ahead." He lit one up, the orange tip glowing in the dim light. The smoke curled around his face, and suddenly the heat of the small room felt heavier, more oppressive. I tried to focus on the clock behind the counter. 45 minutes left. Then 30. The man leaned back against the counter, watching me with a strange intensity, as if trying to figure out what I was thinking. At one point, he pulled out a small knife, flicked it open with a practiced motion, and flipped it closed again. I swallowed hard, heart picking up pace, but I told myself it was just a tool, maybe for fishing or cutting bait. Still, a cold knot tightened in my stomach. Then he said, "You ever think about how easy it is for someone to disappear out here? No one around for miles. Just woods, water, and road." I forced a laugh. "Sounds like the plot of a bad horror movie." He smiled, but it was a tight, humorless thing. "Yeah, maybe. But people vanish every day. No ghosts, just people." The words hung in the air, heavy and real. I felt suddenly exposed, like I wasn't the one in control anymore. Outside, a car door slammed. The man's eyes snapped to the window. I followed his gaze but couldn't see anyone or anything beyond the trembling shadows cast by the moonlight through the trees. He jabbed the cigarette out in the ashtray, then looked back at me. "I should get going." Relief flooded me, but I didn't let it show. "Yeah. Safe travels." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket again, pulling out a small folded piece of paper. He slid it across the counter to me. I unfolded it carefully. Scrawled in shaky handwriting was an address, just a street name and number in the next town over. "For if you ever want to talk," he said quietly. I blinked, surprise mingling with suspicion. "Thanks." He nodded once and pushed open the door. The night swallowed him, the headlights fading down the road. I locked the door behind him, then leaned back against the counter, heart still pounding. The silence returned, but it felt different now, like the calm after a storm. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The moment he walked in, the ordinary had cracked open, and I was left staring into something darker, rawer, and very real. When dawn finally broke over the lake, I stepped outside, breathing in the cold morning air. The paper with the address was folded in my pocket, heavy and sure. I didn't know what was waiting there, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. Because whatever had brushed against me in that bait shop wasn't just a lonely traveler. It was a warning. And it was far from over. Story 2, Beneath the Blackwater Pines. I never expected that walking home from the grocery store at dusk would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, but that's exactly what happened. It started out completely normal, unremarkable, really. I had just picked up a few things for dinner, nothing heavy, a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, some fruit. The store was about a mile from my apartment, and I usually walked it when the weather was decent. That evening, the sky was a dull shade of gray, the kind of light that made everything feel muted, like a faded photograph. The air was chilly, but not cold enough to make me rush. I left the store around 6:30, carrying my groceries in a plastic bag that rattled softly with each step. I took the usual route down Maple Street, past the little park with the rusted swings and cracked basketball court. On other nights, I'd have paused at the bench near the playground to check my phone, but tonight I felt strangely impatient to get home, though I couldn't say why. The street was mostly empty, just a few cars parked along the curb and the occasional dog walker. I noticed a man sitting on the bench near the corner, his head down, shoulders hunched. He was wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, hands stuffed deep in his pockets. Something about him seemed off, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. He didn't look at me as I passed, just stared at the cracked pavement beneath his feet. A few steps later, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I glanced over my shoulder. No one. Just the empty sidewalk stretching back toward the store. I quickened my pace but tried not to look too frantic. I told myself it was probably someone else heading home. Still, the footsteps seemed to keep pace with me, heavy with purpose, but not fast enough to overtake me. I turned a corner onto Birch Lane, which was darker, narrower, the trees growing closer to the sidewalk. I told myself again it was nothing, just someone walking their dog or maybe jogging after work. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint but unmistakable, something metallic mixed with stale sweat, like someone who'd been working hard or maybe hiding something. The scent was coming from behind me, growing stronger as the footsteps got closer. My heart started to thump painfully against my ribs, and a cold rush spread down my spine. I forced myself to keep walking, eyes fixed straight ahead. I pulled my jacket tighter against the wind and tried to focus on the sound of my own breathing, slow and steady. I thought about calling my roommate, but my phone was in the bag with the groceries. I could go back to the store, there were lights, cameras, people, but then I'd be turning around and leading whoever it was to the place I'd just come from. An internal panic made my legs feel heavier, like they might give out any second. Then I heard it, a low voice, just behind me, almost a whisper. "Hey!" My blood froze. I stopped walking, felt the words hang in the air like a threat. "Hey," the voice said again, softer this time. I didn't answer. I looked over my shoulder. The man from the bench was now standing about 10 feet behind me, and something about the way he stood, too still, too focused, made my skin crawl. He wasn't wearing the hoodie anymore, now it was a leather jacket, scuffed and worn. His eyes caught mine for a brief moment, and I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, or maybe just cold calculation. I tried to move past him, faster this time, but my feet felt glued to the ground. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. There was a narrow alley to my right, a shortcut I'd used before when I was late getting home. It was dimly lit, the kind of place where you could easily disappear. Part of me screamed to run, to turn left down the main road and find a cab or a bus. But the practical part of me reminded me I didn't even know if there was any traffic on that street at this hour. "Wait," he said again, voice calm but insistent. I took a shaky step backward, bumping into the chain-link fence that separated the sidewalk from a row of abandoned warehouses. The metal was cold beneath my fingers, rough and unforgiving. My eyes darted around the street, searching for anyone who might be watching, anyone who could help. but the streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that looked like fingers reaching out from the cracks in the pavement. I swallowed hard. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled then, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you see in someone who's just figured out they have the upper hand in a game you didn't even know you were playing. "Just talk," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you." But I didn't believe him. Not for a second. I backed up again, and he matched me step for step. My heart hammered so loudly I thought he'd hear it. The grocery bag slipped from my grasp and hit the ground with a soft thud. Eggs rolled out and cracked, yolk spreading slick and sticky. I didn't have time to care. Suddenly, headlights washed over the street, a car pulling out of a driveway, engine rumbling. The man looked toward the light and then back at me, his expression hardening. Without another word, he stepped into the shadows between the buildings and disappeared as silently as he had appeared. I stood there, frozen, the cold air biting in my cheeks, the broken eggs at my feet a messy reminder of how vulnerable I felt. My phone buzzed inside my bag. I dug it out with trembling hands and saw a message from my roommate, "Leaving work now. You okay?" I typed back quickly, hand shaking, not sure. Someone was following me. "I'm almost home." She replied instantly, "Call me when you get in." "Lock the door." I nodded to myself, though she couldn't see it. I picked up the bag, ignoring the mess, and rushed the last few blocks to my apartment. The familiar roar of the city felt distant here, muffled by the closed windows and the thick walls. I locked the door behind me, double-checked the deadbolt. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to breathe normally, trying to convince myself it was over. But the unease lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. Whoever that man was, he'd found me tonight. And I wasn't sure if he'd be satisfied with just that. The lock clicked shut again, and I slid down the door, the weight of everything pressing down like the darkness outside, waiting. I had never felt truly alone in a city before. Even the nights I worked late shifts at the diner, the hum of traffic and the occasional shout or siren outside offered some strange sense of company. But tonight, walking home through the half-lit streets of the industrial district, the silence was thick, almost unnatural. It pressed in on me like a weight, and every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long. I'd taken a shortcut to save time, cutting through the parking lot behind the shuttered warehouse on Mulberry Street. The cracked asphalt was littered with broken glass and rusted cans. The streetlights flickered weakly overhead, casting pools of yellow that barely pushed back the darkness. A cold wind rattled the plastic bag hanging from a nearby dumpster, and I pulled my jacket tighter, wishing I'd checked the bus schedule and waited for the next one instead. Halfway across the lot, I noticed a figure leaning against the wall near the rusted loading dock. At first, I thought it was someone like me, out late and waiting for a ride. But as I got closer, the way he stood, arms crossed, head tilted down slightly, made my skin crawl. He wasn't doing anything, really, just watching. I caught the glint of his eyes in the dim light, and they felt hungry, restless. I told myself it was a guy waiting for a friend, maybe someone's brother or a security guard on break. Still, my pace quickened. The sound of my shoes scraping on gravel seemed loud and awkward against the quiet. That's when I heard it, the noise of footsteps behind me. Soft, but unmistakable, deliberate, not random. I glanced back. The dark outline was there, moving, but staying maybe 15 or 20 feet behind. Every time I stopped or slowed down, the footsteps stopped too. When I started walking again, they resumed. My heart started thudding, loud enough I was sure anyone nearby could hear it. I considered running, but the parking lot gave me nowhere to hide or escape. The streetlights were too sparse, and the warehouses were all locked up tight. I crossed to the far side, aiming for the main road where more people might be, but the footsteps stayed with me, mirroring my every move. The figure matched my speed, never breaking stride, like he was pacing me. When I reached the edge of the lot, I forced myself to turn and face him directly. The man was maybe in his late 30s, unshaven, dressed in a grimy jacket and jeans. In the pale light, I could see the trace of a scar along his jaw. "You lost?" I asked, trying to sound casual, to mask the rising panic in my voice. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled, slow, deliberate, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. There was a coldness to it, like a predator testing the limits. My throat tightened. I wanted to back away, but it felt like my feet were glued to the ground. "I'm just walking home," I added, hoping to defuse whatever this was. He took a step closer, then stopped. "You're alone," he said, voice low and rough. "Yes," I admitted, swallowing hard. "Bad idea. Round here, that is." I nodded, not trusting my voice. My mind was racing. Was this guy dangerous? Was I about to get robbed, or worse? I looked around for anything that could help me, a witness, a hiding spot, even a rock to throw. He shifted his weight, and that was when I noticed the bulge under his jacket near his hip. I couldn't tell if it was a weapon, but my stomach dropped. This wasn't some random stranger out for a late-night walk. This was someone who meant trouble. I forced a smile. "I live just down the street. I'll be inside soon." He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped even closer until his breath hit my face, sour and stale. I smelled cigarette smoke and something metallic, like oil and rust. "Walk with me," he said suddenly. "No," I said firmly, stepping back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. He laughed quietly, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Come on. Just a little company." I shook my head and turned sharply toward the street. My feet moved faster, desperate now, but I could still hear his footsteps behind me, quickening to match mine. The parking lot gave way to the sidewalk, and I broke into a run, not looking back. For a block or two, the city felt alive again. A few late-night businesses had lights on, a couple of cars passed by. I risked glancing over my shoulder. He'd stopped at the edge of the parking lot, watching me go, but not chasing. When I reached my building, I fumbled with my keys, hands trembling. The man's face burned in my mind, that cold, calculating smile. I slammed the door shut behind me, locked it twice, then pressed my back against it, breathing hard. But the feeling didn't leave me. Even inside my apartment, the silence was heavy, the shadows deeper than usual. I kept the lights on, pacing from window to window, trying to catch a glimpse of movement outside. Every car door slamming or footstep on the sidewalk made me jump. I called my friend, Lisa, my voice barely above a whisper. "Can you come over? I don't feel safe." She agreed immediately, but she was 20 minutes away. 20 minutes was an eternity when you felt hunted. I watched the street through the blinds, heart hammering. After 10 minutes, I saw a figure lean casually against the street lamp across the road. At first, I thought it was somebody else, but the posture, the jacket, the faint outline of that scar, it was him. He was waiting. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I wasn't sure if I could explain any of this without sounding paranoid, or if they'd even take it seriously. I wasn't sure what he wanted or what he might do next. All I knew was that I was trapped inside my own apartment, watching a man who had followed me home and was now deliberately staying just far enough away to be a threat. The city that had felt so familiar and safe only hours ago was suddenly a cage. Lisa's knock on the door shattered the silence, and for a moment, hope flickered. I unlocked the door and pulled her inside, locking it behind her. But through the window, The man was still out there, watching. Waiting. The night shift at the convenience store started like any other Wednesday, slow, with the occasional customer drifting in for late-night snacks or a pack of cigarettes. I usually like these quiet hours. The hum of the fluorescent lights. The faint smell of coffee brewing. The steady beep of the register when someone bought something. It gave me time to think without distraction. But that night, something was off. I just arranged the display of energy drinks when the bell over the door jingled softly. A man walked in, and the first thing I noticed was how he didn't seem to look at anything in particular, not the shelves, not the cashier counter, not even me. He just stood by the doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like he couldn't decide whether to leave or stay. I tried not to stare. It's awkward when a customer won't engage, especially if they're the only one in the store. I cleared my throat and said, "Can I help you find something?" He glanced over as if realizing I was there for the first time. His eyes flicked quickly, almost darting, and he gave this half-smile that didn't reach them. "No, thanks," he said, voice low and rough. He moved deeper inside, but instead of heading to the usual snack aisles, he stopped near the back corner where the cigarettes and lottery tickets were. I kept watching him, trying to figure out what he was doing. His hands were shoved deep inside the pockets of a wrinkled jacket, and he kept looking over his shoulder. The store's layout gave me a clear view from the counter, but that corner was a little shadowed, especially with the dimmer bulbs we kept there. I felt a prickle of unease settle in my stomach. "Are you okay?" I asked again, trying to keep my tone light. He didn't answer. Instead, he bent down slightly, as if picking something up from the floor, but when I looked at the space he passed over, there was nothing there. Then he straightened up, glanced back at the entrance, and started to walk toward the door. Just as he reached it, another customer came in, a woman maybe in her late 20s, carrying a tote bag and wearing a bright yellow raincoat. She paused, gave me a quick smile, and said, "Sorry, did you see a man come in just before me?" Kind of looked. "I don't know, nervous?" I nodded slowly, eyes flicking to the door where the first man had just left. "I thought I saw him hanging around outside when I pulled up." "Felt weird," she said, her voice dropping. I shrugged, trying not to show how on edge I already felt. "Maybe just someone waiting for a ride or something." She nodded but didn't look convinced. "Yeah, maybe." After she left, the store felt too quiet, like the silence had stretched itself taut around me. I kept glancing toward the door, half expecting the man to suddenly come back in. About 30 minutes later, just as I was about to take out the trash, the door jingled again. But this time, it wasn't a customer. It was the man. He stood there, his jacket pulled tight, eyes scanning the aisles like he was searching. "This place closes at midnight," I told him cautiously. He smiled again, the same tired, empty smile, and said, "I know. Just needed to get out of the rain for a minute." I glanced outside. The rain had let up, but the sky was still heavy and dark. Something about him made me hesitate before replying, but I nodded. He stayed inside for maybe 5 minutes, hanging around near the soda coolers. Then, without a word, he left again. I tried to push down the feeling that wasn't just discomfort. It was something more intense, a tightening grip on my gut that wouldn't loosen. When my break came at 1:15 a.m., I stepped outside to the parking lot, hoping the cold air would clear my head. The lot was nearly empty except for a few cars parked far from the entrance. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows. As I lit a cigarette, I caught movement near the edge of the lot, a figure standing just beyond the halo of light. The man. He was there, watching. For a moment, I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks. The figure wasn't moving, just standing still, head tilted slightly as if listening. I stubbed out the cigarette and moved back inside quickly, locking the door behind me. The click echoed louder than I expected. Back inside, I checked the cameras. The feed showed him pacing outside, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the door. He'd been there for at least 20 minutes, well before I stepped out. I called my manager and told her what was going on. She advised me to call the police, but I hesitated. This wasn't the first time someone had loitered outside late at night, and usually, once they saw the cameras or if I made it clear I was watching, they left. I kept watching the screens, alternating between feeling exposed and frozen. Then, about 10 minutes later, the man was suddenly gone. I breathed a little easier but didn't let my guard down. The rest of the shift dragged on. Every sound, the creak of the old floorboards, the distant hum of a car engine, even the soft tapping of rain starting again on the roof, felt amplified, like the building itself was holding its breath. At 3:47 a.m., the bell rang again. But this time, it was 3 young guys in hoodies, laughing and pushing each other as they grabbed snacks and energy drinks. The tension broke just a little, and I even smiled. One of them noticed the camera monitors behind me and said, "You want some security gig or something?" "Just working," I said, forcing lightness into my voice. They left a few minutes later, and the night finally wound down without incident. When my shift ended at 5 a.m., I was relieved to step outside. The rain had stopped, and the air was cool but fresh. The street was deserted except for a stray cat rummaging through a trash bin. Walking to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The parking lot felt enormous and empty, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual. As I unlocked the door, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. No text, just a picture. I opened it, heart pounding. It was a photo of the inside of the convenience store. Taken from an angle I recognized, it was from the back corner where the man had stood earlier. No caption. No sender ID. I swallowed hard, dropping my phone into my pocket. The quiet dread from inside the store had followed me out into the dawn. I drove off slowly, side mirrors catching every movement, every shadow like it was waiting for me to turn back. The night air was unusually cold for late spring as I locked the front door behind me. The street lamp outside flickered softly, casting uneven pools of yellow light across the cracked sidewalk. I'd just finished my shift at the diner, the late one, where the few customers had been quiet, maybe even a little withdrawn. It always felt like the place held its breath during those hours, as if something was waiting just beyond the greasy windows. I was tired, my feet aching from hours on worn linoleum, and all I wanted was to get home, take off my coat, and fall asleep without thinking. But as I stepped off the porch, a strange heaviness settled in my chest. The street was empty and silent in a way that was almost unnatural. A few houses down, a curtain twitched behind a second-story window, but no lights were on. My footsteps echoed unnervingly loud against the row of shuttered homes, and I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more times than I dared to admit. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves and the usual post-work exhaustion, but the feeling refused to fade. Halfway to my car, I noticed a figure standing by the edge of the park across the street. The streetlight barely touched him. He was just a dark shape against the blackness of the trees. At first, I thought he might be waiting for someone, maybe a ride or a friend who'd lost their keys like I had a week ago. But his posture was too still, too deliberate. He didn't shift weight or glance around the way someone waiting anxiously would. His head was tilted forward slightly, like he was staring at me or waiting for me to meet his gaze. I stopped, heart thudding. The figure didn't move. For a moment, I thought about crossing the street to avoid him, but everything inside me froze. I told myself to stay calm, to keep walking, to not look back. The rational voice in my head repeated, "He's just a person. Maybe he's cold. Maybe he's waiting for the bus." There was no bus at this hour, but that detail slipped past my mind like a minor inconvenience. I started walking again, faster this time, the sound of my shoes scraping the asphalt unnerving in the quiet. The figure remained where he was. I pulled out my phone to check the time and almost dropped it when I noticed a new notification, an unknown number calling repeatedly. I didn't answer. I didn't know about this strange man or the call unsettled me more. When I got to my car, I fumbled with the keys, hands trembling. I glanced back. The figure had crossed the street and was now walking toward me. Not running, just walking steadily, deliberately, like he wasn't in a hurry but didn't want to be missed. My breath came shallow and fast. I unlocked the door, slid inside, and locked it immediately. The man stopped at the curb, just out of reach of the headlights. He looked down at something in his hands, a phone, I thought, and then up at me. His face was unreadable, expressionless. I tried to start the engine, but my fingers felt clumsy, as if they belonged to someone else. The car clicked once, twice, before the engine roared to life. I peeled out of the driveway without looking back, leaving the man standing alone on the street, swallowed by the dark. Nothing happened on the drive home, but the unease stayed with me. I kept checking the rearview mirror, watching for headlights or shadows, but saw nothing. Still, when I unlocked my apartment door later that night, I took the extra few seconds to double-check all the locks. The chain latch I rarely use clicked into place, and I breathed a little easier. That relief didn't last long. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again. A text from the unknown number, "I saw you leave the diner." My heart stopped. I stared at the message, fingers trembling over the screen. I didn't respond. I wanted to call the police but dismissed it. The message wasn't a direct threat, yet it carried an unmistakable weight, a cold, patient observation that made me feel exposed and vulnerable. I put the phone down and paced the small living room. The curtains were drawn, but the street lamp outside bled through the fabric in thin, uneven lines. I kept hearing every small noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the old wooden floor, the faint rustle of leaves against the window. Each sound turned into a threat in my mind. Then, the knock came. Soft, deliberate, 3 quick taps. Not the kind of knock a neighbor would make late at night. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The knocking stopped. I waited, heart pounding, but no one tried again. I didn't answer. Minutes passed. Then, another knock, slower this time, once, pause, twice. It was a pattern, like a code. My mind raced through every horror story I'd ever heard, every warning I'd ever ignored. I reached under the couch for the baseball bat I kept just in case, the one I'd never had to use. I inched to the peephole and looked out. The hallway was empty, silent. No shadows. I strained my ears for footsteps, but heard nothing except the hum of the building's old heater. I backed away, locked the deadbolt, and pulled the chain latch closed. I debated calling the police again, but didn't want to seem paranoid without proof. Instead, I texted my roommate, who was out of town. I told him everything, the figure outside the diner, the calls, the messages, the knocking. I asked him to check security cameras for me, if he could. He replied quickly, telling me to stay safe, to call the cops if anything else happened. Another buzz from my phone. Another message, "You should be more careful." I turned off the lights, sat on the couch with the bat across my lap, and stared into the darkened window. The street lamp outside blinked out, plunging the street into shadow. The silence felt endless, stretching thicker with every passing minute. Eventually, the knocking stopped, the messages stopped, and the world seemed to hold its breath. But I knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, waiting for me to slip up, to let my guard down. I realized I wasn't just afraid of a stranger anymore. I was afraid that the people around me, the places I thought were safe, could become traps. And all I wanted was to get through the night without losing myself to panic. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat by the window, bat in hand, eyes fixed on the street, listening for a sound I hoped never came. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so exposed, though no one had broken into my apartment yet. I sat on the edge of the threadbare couch, the dull hum of the heater filling the silence. Outside, the sky drained into a bruise of dark blue and gray, and the occasional car tire hissed over wet asphalt. The rain wasn't heavy but persistent, tapping a soft, uneven rhythm against the window pane. From the street, the muffled footfalls of late-night pedestrians drifted up, irregular and distant. It was just a normal Tuesday night, or it should have been. I'd forced myself to stay awake later than usual, waiting for a call from my sister. She'd been traveling, and the connection was spotty, but after the events of the past week, I needed to hear a familiar voice. The tension that had lodged itself behind my ribs felt like a slow, spreading fire, and I was desperate for distraction more than anything else. My phone buzzed, and I jumped, startled by the sudden noise. The screen glowed with my sister's name. I swiped to answer. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, you. How's it going?" Her voice was warm but tired. "Okay, I guess. Just staying up late." There was a pause. "Are you sure you're okay?" I hesitated, the knot tightening in my stomach. "Yeah. It's just been a weird week." She sighed. "I know. Have you called the cops about the break-in?" I swallowed. "I did. They said they'd send someone by to check the security footage. But it's probably just a random thief." "Are you sure? You said you saw someone outside your window last night, right?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yeah. A guy. Just standing there. Didn't move. When I looked again, he was gone." "That's creepy. Did you tell your neighbors?" "Not really. I don't know them well. And I didn't want to seem paranoid." "You're not paranoid," she said. "Just be careful." I ended the call feeling a little lighter but still tense. It was almost midnight now, and the building was quiet except for the occasional creak in the pipes and the rustle of the wind outside. I stood and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain a crack. The street lamp flickered, casting weak pools of light on the wet sidewalk. There was no one there. I exhaled slowly, trying to shake the lingering unease. My fingers trailed over the cold glass, and I noticed a smudge that hadn't been there earlier. It looked like a fingerprint, but faint and smeared, as if someone had pressed their hand against the glass and then wiped it hurriedly. Suddenly the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I jumped back as a sharp knock sounded at the door. Not the apartment door, but the front door to the building's lobby. My heart hammered, and I pressed my ear to the door. Another knock, this time louder, more insistent. I didn't recognize the voice when it came. "Hey, you in there?" "It's me, Jake. Let me in." Jake was one of the maintenance guys who came by occasionally. I'd never met him in person, only caught glimpses in the hallway. But something about the voice sounded off, too low, too rough. I hesitated. "Jake?" "Yeah, man. Forgot my keys. They locked up early today. Just let me in." I glanced at the security camera monitor by the elevator, static. The building's cameras had gone dark hours ago, probably due to the storm. I felt a sinking sensation. I didn't want to open that door. "No, sorry, the lobby door's locked. I don't have a key." There was a pause. Then the knocks came faster, harder, like someone trying to break the door down. "Come on, man. I'm stuck out here." My breath caught. I could hear footsteps shifting, scraping against the concrete stairs. "Look, I'm calling the front desk." I reached for my phone and dialed the building management, but the call didn't connect. No dial tone, just static and a faint scratching sound. The footsteps outside stopped suddenly. I crouched by the door, pressing my ear against the cold wood. Nothing. I turned and scanned the apartment, my mind racing. The windows were locked. The balcony door too. There was no other entrance. Then, from the street, came the sound of a car door slamming, tires spinning on wet pavement, and headlights retreating down the block. The knocking didn't resume. Relief washed over me, but it was thin and brittle. I sat back down on the couch, clutching my phone, eyes darting to every shadow. A sudden creak from the floor above made me freeze. The building was supposed to be empty except for me. I got up and padded silently to the stairwell door. It was locked from the outside. I looked back toward the window. A figure stood across the street, barely visible under the flickering street lamp. He was still, his face obscured by a hood. I blinked, and he was gone. My heart slammed against my ribs as I shut the curtain and locked the window. I had no idea who those people were, Jake, the man outside, and I had no idea what they wanted. The confusion only deepened my fear. I told myself to call the police again, but with the phone dead and the cameras out, it felt like screaming into a void. I sat in the dark, listening. The rain tapped steadily on the roof, the silence broken only by the occasional distant siren. And I waited. Story 3, Threat of Unseen Fate. The night I was followed started out like any other Thursday. I left work around 7, the sky a bruise of purple and orange fading to navy. My office was on the edge of downtown, a nondescript glass building where I spent most days hunched over a computer screen, eyes dry and fingers stiff from typing. I'd been thinking about picking up dinner on the way home, but the idea of waiting in line at a crowded restaurant after a long day made me reconsider. Instead, I grabbed a coffee from the corner cafe and started the 20-minute walk to my apartment. It was early fall, the air sharp but not cold yet, with the faint smell of damp leaves and exhaust from nearby cars. I zipped my jacket a little higher and stuffed my hands into the pockets. The street lamps flickered on as I passed empty storefronts and the occasional late-night bar. Most people were already inside for the evening, so the sidewalks were mostly deserted, save for a few stragglers like me. I noticed in the moment I turned onto Maple Street, the quieter residential block where I lived. He was standing across the street under a weak street lamp, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. At first, I thought he was just waiting for someone or something, maybe smoking a cigarette, but no smoke ever appeared from his mouth. He didn't move much, just shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The way he was looking, if he was looking at all, felt wrong, like a bird watching a fish trapped in a bowl. I kept my pace steady, but my stomach knotted. Maple Street was usually a peaceful stretch, lined with old brick houses, well-kept lawns, and occasional porch lights glowing warmly. But that night the street lamp near him buzzed faintly, casting an unnatural yellow haze, making everything feel off. The man didn't step aside as I passed, he stayed rooted in place, and I caught that his eyes, barely visible in the dim light, weren't focusing on anything beyond me. I told myself not to look back. I had to remind myself I wasn't being paranoid. People stand around for all sorts of reasons. Maybe he was on his phone, waiting for a ride or just taking a break. Still, once I reached my building's front door, I glanced over my shoulder. He was still there. The door to my apartment clanged shut behind me, the sound sharp in the quiet hallway. I immediately checked the lock, turning the deadbolt twice. The building was old but secure, steel door, buzzer system, the works. I fumbled with my keys as I tried to steady my breathing. After locking myself inside, I crossed the small living room to the window. From there, I could see the street below. The street lamp's glow was a muted circle on the pavement, and for a second, I thought I saw movement, a shadow detaching itself from the darkness near the building across the road. But when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself this was probably nothing. Maybe I was just tired, or my imagination was playing tricks on me. I made a cup of tea, the kettle's whistle piercing the quiet as I tried to focus on the familiar routine. The warmth of the mug in my hands was comforting, grounding me. About 15 minutes later, when I checked the window again, a figure was standing directly beneath my building's front steps, not the man from before, or at least not exactly. This one wore a baseball cap low over his face, and he was looking up at my window, unmoving, as if waiting for me. I ducked out of sight and closed the curtains, my heart starting to pound. I debated calling someone, but told myself I shouldn't overreact. Maybe it was a homeless person looking for shelter or a kid messing around. I turned on every light in the apartment to make it clear someone was home. The sudden brightness made the shadows retreat, but the figure below didn't leave. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching out like a rubber band about to snap. I sat on the couch, eyes fixed on the window, listening to the distant hum of the city and the occasional creak of the building settling. Then I heard a noise, soft footsteps on the gravel path leading around the side of the building. I froze. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They didn't sound like anyone just passing by. They sounded like someone searching, circling the building. The gravel crunched under heavy boots, close enough now that I could hear their rhythm clearly. I considered calling the police but hesitated, uncertain if I'd be taken seriously or if I was overreacting. After a moment, the footsteps stopped near the back door. There was a faint, almost inaudible scraping noise, like someone trying to pry something open. My pulse was thundering in my ears. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers, my eyes darting between the dark window and the door. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline as I whispered my address and explained the situation. I stayed on the line, heart hammering, as the sounds outside persisted. The scraping grew louder, more frantic, then suddenly stopped. I didn't dare make a sound or move for what felt like an eternity. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the city beyond the building. Then, footsteps running, retreating quickly down the alley. The man was gone. I waited for 15 minutes before cautiously peeking through the peephole. The back door was still locked, but the frame looked warped, the wood splintered near the latch. Whoever had tried to get in hadn't succeeded. The police arrived soon after, their flashlights cutting through the night. They took my statement, checked the perimeter, and reassured me a patrol would be increased around the building. Still, their casual tone did little to calm the knot in my stomach. After they left, I sat on the floor in the corner of the living room, the kettle silently cooling on the stove. The night stretched ahead, impossibly long and uncertain. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been outside wasn't done watching me. The summer light was fading when I decided to take the longer route home. It was a quiet Tuesday, and the streets around the office had thinned out as rush hour died down, but the weight in my chest from the morning's unease hadn't lifted. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the leftover tension from last week's argument with Mark, or maybe the lack of sleep. Still, I chose the path along the riverbank, where I could hear the slow burble of the water and feel softer breezes against my skin. The idea of spending even a few more minutes in the heavier city air felt like a reprieve. The path was narrower here, hemmed in by thick bushes and tall grass, and I was alone. A few joggers had passed earlier, but now the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional birds settling down for the night. I walked briskly, the soles of my sneakers padding softly against the cracked asphalt. the scent of damp earth and cut grass mixed with the faint, almost metallic tang of the river. About halfway through, a man appeared ahead on the path, moving toward me. He was older, maybe mid-40s, wearing a faded blue jacket and jeans. His pace was steady but slow, and he kept glancing down at his phone. I noticed the screen glow catch his face, highlighting a pale complexion and deep lines etched around tense eyes. Nothing about him seemed overtly threatening, just out of place. Most people would have passed me with a quick nod or smiled, but he kept looking up just long enough to catch my gaze, then quickly dropping his eyes again. I sped up, telling myself I was imagining things. The city had weird pockets where people behaved oddly, or maybe the man was just shy or distracted. But as I passed him, I caught the faint smell of cigarettes lingering around his collar, despite the cool, fresh air. That small detail felt off, though I couldn't say why. I put more distance between us, turning the corner toward the footbridge that spanned the river. The metal grating creaked under my steps, echoing far louder than it should have. Halfway across, I glanced back. The man was still behind me, but now he was walking faster. His strides lengthened, and the phone was gone from his hands. My pulse quickened. I told myself to stay calm, but every instinct screamed otherwise. My fingers tightened around the strap of my bag, and I kept my eyes ahead, though I fought the urge to look back again. The path on the other side was busier, with a small group of cyclists and a pair of dog walkers. I felt relief wash over me, thinking I'd reached safety. But then I heard footsteps, quick, uneven, against the bridge behind me. The man's breathing was audible now, ragged and shallow. I risked a glance backward and saw him break into a run. Panic kicked in. I broke into a sprint. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the sounds of the world around me. The cyclists ahead stopped and stared as I barreled past, shouting for help. The dog walkers looked alarmed but didn't move. I kept running, glancing over my shoulder. The man was gaining on me. I reached the street and sprinted toward the nearest open store, a small convenience shop with bright fluorescent lights. I burst inside, gasping for breath, and the clerk looked up in surprise. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Someone's following me," I said, voice trembling. "Please, can I stay here for a minute?" She nodded and locked the door behind me. I looked out the window just in time to see the man slow to a halt at the edge of the riverbank path. He stood there, watching the shop, his face unreadable in the dim light. I called Mark, my hand shaking as I explained what had happened. He promised to come as soon as he could. The clerk offered me water, and I sat near the counter, trying to steady my breath. Every time I looked outside, the man was still there, lingering like a shadow, refusing to move on. Minutes crawled by. Eventually, the man turned and disappeared back down the path. The clerk locked the door again and told me to stay put until Mark arrived. When he finally showed up, I felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made me cry. We walked back together, eyes darting to every shadow, every movement. The path was empty. The river flowed quietly. But I knew the man hadn't gone far. Somewhere nearby, he was watching and waiting, and the nightmare was far from over. We hurried along the riverbank, the moon casting sickly pale light over the twisted trees. Every crunch of leaves underfoot made my heart leap. Mark kept glancing over his shoulder, his breath shallow and quick. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed through the underbrush. We froze, eyes straining into the darkness. From the shadows emerged a man, his face a grotesque mask of rage and decay, eyes sunken and wild. He moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between us in a heartbeat. Mark grabbed my arm, pulling me toward a narrow ravine. "Run," he hissed. We plunged down the slope, branches clawing at us like desperate hands. Behind us, The man's scream split the night, a sound that would haunt every step we took from that cursed place. We tumbled into a dark hollow, gasping as the world seemed to close around us. The scream faded, but the chilling echo lingered. I was supposed to pick up the new couch that Saturday afternoon. The Craigslist ad had seemed legitimate enough, a guy down near the docks selling a barely used sectional for a fraction of what it normally cost. I figured I could haul it back to the apartment in my old pickup, and maybe save myself a couple $100 over a store delivery. The day was bright with a low, steel gray sky, the kind that makes everything look a little drained of color. The kind that makes you notice details you might otherwise overlook. I pulled into the dusty lot behind one of the warehouses along Harbor Street. It wasn't exactly bustling, mostly empty except for a few rusted vans and stacks of shipping pallets leaning against the corrugated walls. I didn't see the seller at first, which was odd. We'd agreed on 3 p.m., and I was 15 minutes early. I stepped out of the truck and scanned the area. A man was sitting on a folding chair near one of the pallets, smoking a cigarette. He was middle-aged, with that rough, weather-beaten look you see on guys who work outdoors all day. His jeans were stained, boots caked with mud. When he saw me looking, he waved me over. That's when I noticed it, the man's eyes cold, sharp, darting quickly. It was the kind of gaze that seems like it's measuring you, calculating something beneath the surface. I told myself I was just being paranoid, an overactive imagination fueled by too many true crime podcasts. "Hey," he said, voice low and gravelly. "You're the guy for the couch." "Yeah," I said, walking closer. "You sure it's still available?" He nodded and stood up, stretching a little. He motioned me to follow him around the corner of the warehouse. We reached a loading dock where the sectional was covered with a tarp in the back of an old pickup truck. The man pulled back the tarp to reveal the couch. It looked fine, nothing broken or stained. I told him I wanted to see the underside to check for bed bugs or any damage. He hesitated, then shifted the couch just enough for me to peek underneath. While I was crouched down, I caught a glimpse of something wrapped in a moldy blanket in the corner of the truck bed, just beyond the couch. It was bulky, oddly shaped. I couldn't quite make it out, but it didn't look like furniture. I straightened up, forcing a casual smile. "Everything seems good. I'll pay you now." He fished a battered metal box out of his jacket pocket and flipped it open, revealing a handful of 20s. I handed him the cash, and he tucked it away with a nod. "Need a hand loading this?" I asked, already dreading the awkward maneuvering. He said he was fine, but then surprised me by climbing into the truck bed himself and lifting one end of the couch. His grip was stronger than I expected. We hoisted the couch up onto my tailgate, then carefully slid it into the bed of my pickup. As we worked, I noticed the man kept glancing over my shoulder toward the empty lot, like he was expecting someone or something. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying not to sound nervous. He shrugged. "Just can't shake the feeling someone's been hanging around here." "You ever get the same?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I'd want to say. The docks always gave me an uneasy vibe, dark corners, abandoned buildings. But this was the first time I'd ever met someone who actually seemed worried about it. When the couch was secured, I turned to thank him. That's when I noticed the thin, nearly invisible scar running across the side of his neck, just beneath his shirt collar. It was fresh, maybe a week old. It made me wonder what kind of life he led. I climbed back into the truck, and as I started the engine, he asked, "You live alone?" "Yeah," I said, glancing out the window. The lot was still empty except for us. "I'm sorry if I'm being nosy," he said, voice quieter now. "Just stay safe out there, all right? People aren't who they seem." I nodded but didn't answer. He gave me a small, grim smile and walked off toward the main road. I sat there for a moment, the engine idling, trying to shake the strange knot in my stomach. I decided I'd take a different route home, one that skipped the old bridge that creaked and moaned whenever the wind picked up. The streets were emptier than usual, the late afternoon shifting toward early evening, and the sky thickened with clouds that threatened rain. As I drove, I kept catching flickers of movement in the side mirrors. Shadows that didn't match the shapes of trees or signs. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of a small park, the way they stood unnervingly still, like they were watching. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I tried telling myself it was nothing, a trick of the light or some passerby, but the unsettling feeling only grew. When I pulled into my apartment complex, my heart was pounding. The place was unusually quiet. No kids riding bikes, no neighbors chatting in the hallways. Just the hum of an old air conditioner somewhere down the block. I locked the truck, took the couch cushions inside first, and then the frame. Everything felt heavier than usual, like the day's unease had stuck to me. Inside my apartment, I triple-checked the locks on the door and windows. Then, as I unpacked a box of tools to put the couch together, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It read, "Saw you at the docks." My breath caught. I stared at the screen for a long moment, heart hammering against my ribs. The rational part of me wanted to shrug it off, someone messing with me, a coincidence. But the memory of the man's sharp eyes, the scar, the way he'd warned me, it all came rushing back. I hesitated before typing a reply, fingers trembling. "Who is this?" No response. Just silence. And then, somewhere outside, a car door slammed shut. I pressed myself against the wall, listening. The sounds of the city carried on, the distant siren, a dog barking, but beneath it all, I could feel the weight of those eyes again, watching, waiting. I wasn't alone anymore. I had never thought of myself as someone who got nervous easily, but by the time I reached my car that night, every instinct I tried to ignore was screaming at me. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few cars spaced far apart under the weak yellow glow of flickering street lamps. It wasn't a place I usually found unsettling. It was an ordinary lot, behind a nondescript office building, where I parked every evening after my shift. But tonight, somehow, it felt as if the shadows themselves had weight. My shift had ended at 11:30 p.m. I'd stayed later than usual, trying to finish some paperwork, just to avoid the early morning rush. The office was cold, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the only sound coming from the tapping of my keyboard. When I finally left, the air was crisp, with the faint but unmistakable scent of rain on the horizon. I pulled my coat tighter around me as I walked across the lot toward my car, the heels of my boots clicking sharply on the cracked asphalt. That's when I noticed a man. He was standing near the far end of the lot, where the light barely reached. At first, I thought he was just another late worker or someone waiting for a ride. His back was to me, hands in his jacket pockets, head bowed slightly. But there was something off, too still, too deliberate about how he stood. I tried not to look, told myself I was being paranoid. I unlocked my car door and slipped inside, the lock clicking shut behind me. I sat there for a moment, fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the man's silhouette. He hadn't moved. If anything, he seemed more rigid. As I started the engine, the man shifted slowly, turning his head. I caught the glint of his eyes reflecting the pale light. Our gazes locked for a second that stretched forever. Without thinking, I pressed the accelerator, tires squealing slightly as I pulled out of the parking space. The streets were eerily quiet. Usually, even at this late hour, there was some traffic or the occasional pedestrian, but tonight, it was just me and the empty road. The radio was off, and the hum of the engine sounded impossibly loud inside the car. Every few blocks, I glanced in the rearview mirror. At first, There was nothing. Then I saw headlights, distant, but steadily growing closer. My heart thumped harder. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just someone else driving home. But the car behind me kept pace, never overtaking or falling behind. I took a turn onto a side street, hoping to lose it, but the headlights followed. The streetlights flickered on and off, shadows flitting across the buildings like restless ghosts. I felt trapped, the walls of the narrow street closing in. I considered pulling over, calling someone, but my phone was dead. I'd forgotten to charge it after a long day, and the cold had probably drained whatever little battery remained. The idea of stopping terrified me more than continuing, so I pressed on, turning down another street. The car behind me hesitated briefly, then followed. Panic started to edge into my chest, making it hard to breathe. I thought about the emergency call button on the dashboard, but I wasn't sure if it would connect without a phone. I fumbled with the buttons, but the system required a cellular signal. Nothing. I glanced again at the rearview mirror. The car was closer now, only a few feet behind. I caught a glimpse of the driver, too far away to recognize clearly, but the way the headlights framed their face made their eyes look unnaturally bright, like they were watching me with a strange intensity. I tried to remember the route home, the streets I could take to get onto the highway. The highway meant more cars, more people, and hopefully more safety. I turned sharply onto a busier avenue, my tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. The street lamps here were brighter, and a few late-night shops flickered with neon signs. The car stayed behind me, though it slowed when other cars merged into the lanes. I was almost at a gas station, a small oasis of light and activity. I told myself to keep going, drive straight through, and not stop until I was out of this nightmare. But just as I approached the station's entrance, the car swerved slightly and pulled into the lot behind me. I didn't wait to see what they would do next. Slamming my foot on the accelerator, I charged past the pumps, tires spraying water from puddles. The man's car roared after me, engine growling in the sudden chase. My lungs burned, and my knuckles were white from gripping the wheel. I forced myself to stay on the road, taking sharp turns, avoiding pedestrians who yelled at me as I sped past. The city was waking up in the distance, the faint orange glow of dawn beginning to seep into the sky. Finally, I reached the police station. The sight of the flashing blue and red lights felt like a lifeline. I pulled into the parking lot, heart hammering so loudly I was sure the officers inside could hear it. I killed the engine and sat still for a moment, listening. The car that had been behind me was nowhere to be seen. I stepped out, hands trembling, and hurried inside. The officers were friendly but asked for details I could barely remember in my frantic state. I told them about the man in the parking lot, the car that followed me, the fear that had gripped me like a vice. They took down my statement and promised to send patrols to the area that night. I thanked them, trying to steady my voice. As I stepped back outside, the morning air felt colder, sharper. I looked back toward the street where I'd last seen the car, but it was empty. For now, I was safe. But the feeling in my gut told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I told myself it was just one of those nights. The kind you want to forget as soon as the sun comes up. But sitting here now, with the shadows pressing against the windows and my heart hammering like a warning bell in my chest, I know that doesn't quite cut it. Not anymore. I'd left work late, a little past midnight, after covering for a coworker who called in sick. The office had felt cavernous and cold, the hum of the fluorescent lights making the silence worse. Usually, the ride home was uneventful, a 30-minute drive through quiet streets lined with old trees and shuttered houses. But that night, something was off. It started when I pulled into the parking lot behind my apartment complex. The lot was nearly empty except for one car parked under the flickering lamp by the entrance. A dark sedan, tinted windows, engine off. I didn't think much of it at first, someone visiting a neighbor, maybe, but then the street light above it sputtered and died, swallowing the car in shadow. I grabbed my bag and started toward the building entrance, the uneven pavement crunching beneath my boots. The air was sharp, carrying a faint chill that raised goosebumps on my arms despite my jacket. When I reached for the door, my fingers brushed against something wet on the handle. I recoiled. Blood? I looked closer, but it was just some dark, sticky residue, probably rust or oil, but for a moment the thought made my stomach twist. Inside, the hallway was dim, the bulbs on a timer that flickered sluggishly. I pressed the button to call the elevator, tapping my foot impatiently. When the door slid open, I stepped inside and caught my reflection in the polished metal walls, wide eyes, pale face, hair sticking up in random tufts as if I'd just been through a storm. The elevator hummed up slowly. On the 4th floor, the lights flickered again, and I noticed a shadow move just outside the glass of the corridor. Someone was there, no doubt about it. I stepped out, eyes darting to the end of the hallway where the shadow had vanished. The corridor was deserted, but I could feel eyes on me. I didn't want to run, didn't want to show panic, but my breath quickened. My apartment door was a few meters away, and when I reached it, I fumbled with my keys for longer than usual, hands trembling. Inside, I locked the door behind me, double-checked the deadbolt, then slid the chain into place. I slid down against the door, chest heaving, ears straining for any sound outside. The only noise was the faint rustle of wine through the cracked window and the distant hum of a car making its way down the street. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was just tired, imagining things, but the unease clung to me like a cold sweat. I turned on every light, flicked the television to a static news channel, and paced the small living room, looking out the window toward the parking lot. The sedan was gone. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? Somebody was lurking outside my building, and I'm scared. It sounded ridiculous, but a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that it wasn't nothing. Trying to distract myself, I went to the kitchen to make tea. The kettle's whistle pierced the silence, a shrill reminder of how quiet the night was. I heard a noise from the bedroom, like something brushing against the window. I froze, heart stopping. I switched off the lights and crept closer. The window was latched tight. Outside, the tree branches scraped against the glass, pushed by the wind. Still, the noise felt deliberate, rhythmic. I leaned in, peering through the curtain into the darkness. There was a figure crouched just beyond the glass, barely visible against the night, but the outline was unmistakable. Someone was there. I stumbled back, tripping over a chair, and hit the floor hard. The figure disappeared, but my mind was racing too fast to think clearly. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address like a secret. The dispatcher's calm voice was a bomb, but I couldn't stop shaking. They said an officer would be sent immediately. Minutes dragged on like hours. I sat on the floor, clutching the phone, ears straining for any sound. And then I heard it, the lock on the front door rattling, faint but unmistakable. Whoever had been outside was trying to get in. I scrambled to my feet and moved to the kitchen, where I tapped an old butcher knife from a camping trip in a drawer. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The door rattled again, more violently this time, and I heard muffled voices just beyond. "Police are on their way," I whispered to myself, hoping the words would keep me steady. The door handle jiggled, and then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The silence pressed back down, thick and suffocating. I stayed hidden in the kitchen, knife gripped tight, phone pressed against my ear, heartbeat loud enough to drown out the world. Another noise, a soft tapping at the window in the living room. My breath caught. Slowly, I crept toward the sound, every muscle tense and ready to run. When I reached the window, the figure was back, crouched low, face obscured. I couldn't see features, only the glint of something metallic in their hand. A knife, or a screwdriver, maybe. I slammed the blinds down and backed away, shaking uncontrollably. A loud knock came at the door, insistent this time. The officer's voice was calm and firm when I opened it, and I collapsed into relief, tears spilling down my cheeks. I told him everything: the parking lot car, the shadow in the hallway, the figure outside my window, the rattling door. He took the report, told me they patrol the area more frequently, and advised me to stay with a neighbor if I felt unsafe. I nodded numbly, still shaking. That night I didn't sleep. Every creak, every whisper of wind, made me jump. I kept the knife by my side and the door locked behind me. The figure never came back, but the weight of their presence lingered, a shadow cast over my once safe home. I thought it was over. I thought the worst had passed. But as dawn broke, and I tried to push the panic down, I realized something worse was waiting just outside, patient and silent. And I wasn't sure how long I could keep running in place before it caught up with me. Story 4, Lost Hours, The Vanishing Clock. I never thought the walk home from the train station would feel like the longest stretch of my life. The sky was already bruising with dusk when I stepped off the last car, the air heavy with the smell of rain and wet concrete. It was just past 8, not late enough for the streets to be empty, but quiet enough that the usual hum of city chatter had dulled to a low murmur. I glanced at my phone, no messages. Just the usual dead silence waiting for me on the other end of the screen. My roommate was out of town this week, and I was alone in our cramped apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better days. The walk from the station to my neighborhood usually took about 15 minutes, cutting through a narrow alley lined with closed shops and a few flickering street lamps. I wasn't in any rush. My shoulders were tired from the day, my backpack heavier than usual with textbooks and a laptop I never used except in moments like these, when deadlines threatened to swallow me whole. Still, I told myself, it was a weekend, nothing to worry about. That first step into the alley was when I noticed it, the lingering quiet that felt too thick, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Ahead of me, a man stood near the corner store, a place I'd never seen open so late. He was tall, thin, wearing a dark jacket zipped all the way up, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His head flicked up as I approached, and for a moment, I thought he was looking past me, scanning the street behind. I kept my gaze forward but noticed that his eyes were sharp and oddly still, like a predator waiting for something subtle to change. I tried to shrug off the unease. Maybe he was just waiting for someone, or maybe he was a night worker on a break. But as I stepped closer, the scent of cigarette smoke drifted toward me, a sharp, acrid odor that didn't quite fit with the dampness of the evening. The man's face was mostly shadowed, but I could see a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, something like a smirk or a grimace. I hurried past him, ears suddenly alert to every footstep that wasn't my own. Halfway through the alley, I heard a faint shuffle behind me. My breath hitched, and I glanced over my shoulder. The man was still there, but now he was moving, slow and deliberate, keeping a few paces between us. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe he was just going the same way, but my heart was thumping too loud, and each step felt heavier than the last. I considered crossing the street, but the road was slick with rain, and the streetlights cast uneven pools of light, making the shadows twitch like dark fingers. A rat scurried past my feet, and I jumped, cursing under my breath. The man's footsteps echoed behind me, steady and unhurried, matching my pace like a metronome set to my own anxiety. Up ahead, the corner where the alley met the main road was a little plaza with a bench and a flickering lamppost. I thought maybe if I reached that spot, I could catch a cab or at least find someone else. I quickened my steps, trying not to look back again, but the sounds behind me didn't stop. Instead, they seemed to grow louder, more certain. I reached the bench and paused, heart hammering, trying to steady my breathing. The streetlights above buzzed faintly, and the distant sound of a car door slamming broke the silence. For a moment, I thought I was safe. I looked around for a taxi or a familiar face, but the plaza was empty. The man was nowhere in sight. Relieved, I pulled out my phone to call my roommate, just to say I was on my way and everything was fine. My hands trembled as I typed, but the screen stayed dark, dead battery. I cursed again, sliding the phone back into my pocket. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the plaza, partially hidden by the shadow of a tree, eyes locked on me. No smile now, just a cold, unreadable look that made my skin crawl. His jacket was unzipped a little, revealing a plain white shirt. He didn't move when I looked up, didn't blink. Just waited, silent and still. I swallowed hard and started walking again, this time faster, toward the main street. The man followed, stepping out from the tree's shadow with slow, deliberate moves. I felt trapped, like the world around me had narrowed to just him and me, the rest of the city receding into a dull background noise. I tried to tell myself to stay calm, to think logically. If I crossed the street and walked toward the busier part of town, someone would notice. But my legs felt like lead. Every instinct screamed to run, but my mind was tangled in fear and disbelief. When I reached the crosswalk, I glanced back once more. The man stopped at the plaza's edge and didn't follow. For the first time that night, I felt something like relief, the weight in my chest easing just a bit. I crossed quickly, the traffic light clicking in cadence with my heartbeat. On the other side, a group of teenagers laughed loudly, a stark contrast to the silence I'd been swallowed by. I told one of them, half joking, that I thought I'd been followed. They shrugged, distracted, but I noticed one of them glanced down the alley after me, eyes narrowing just for a moment. I kept walking, head down, trying to convince myself it was over. But the feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. When I finally reached the small park near my building, the street lamps flickered again, and the wind kicked up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded too much like whispers. I paused at the gate, keys shaking in my hand. Just as I was about to unlock the door, I caught a movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between the trees, too quick to be sure. I didn't stop to look again. I swung the door open, stepped inside, and locked it behind me, pressing my back against it as if that could shield me from whatever was out there. The hallway was dim and smelled faintly of bleach and mildew. I fumbled for the light switch, and when the bulb sputtered to life, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But the unease didn't fade. It just settled into the pit of my stomach, a dull ache that told me this was far from over. The evening had slipped into a gray dusk when I finally locked the door behind me. I had been at the office later than usual, buried in spreadsheets and trying to finish the quarterly report before Monday. The streets were nearly empty, the city shedding its daytime bustle like a snake sheds skin. I didn't mind. I liked the quiet, the way the muted streetlights cast long shadows against the sidewalks, the occasional soft breeze that rattled loose leaves along the curb. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and headed toward the bus stop 2 blocks from my apartment. It wasn't far, but I didn't want to risk taking a cab and paying extra for a trip that short. Besides, I liked walking. It gave me a little time to think, decompress from the day. The streetlights flickered overhead, one of them buzzing faintly before going out altogether, leaving a patch of sidewalk submerged in near darkness. I hesitated but kept walking, the faint crunch of my boots on gravel and scattered leaves the only sounds around me. There wasn't another soul in sight. That's when I noticed the man standing by the entrance to the empty corner store. He was tall, the kind of lanky that made his limbs look like they'd snap if he moved too quickly. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there with his hands in his coat pockets, head tilted down slightly. When I caught his eyes, I looked away quickly and kept walking. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed strange people hanging around at odd hours. Downtown had plenty of that, and usually, they were harmless. But something about this guy unsettled me, maybe the way he didn't move when I passed, just watching. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Halfway down the block, I glanced back. He was following, keeping a distance but definitely coming my way. My heart thudded hard inside my chest, and suddenly the night felt colder, heavier. I quickened my pace, trying to appear unbothered, but the pounding in my ears drowned out the night's sounds. When I crossed the street, I thought maybe I'd lost him. The shadows swallowed his figure, and I couldn't see him anymore. Relief flooded me, brief and fragile. By the time I reached the bus stop, I was nearly shaking. The plastic bench was cold under my fingers as I sat down, pulling my jacket tighter around my body like armor. I scanned the street, trying to catch any sign of him, but there was nothing. The bus was due in 5 minutes, according to the peeling sign. 5 long minutes. I tried to breathe evenly, but every sudden noise, the rattle of a loose shutter, the distant bark of a dog, made me jump. Then I heard footsteps again, slow and deliberate, approaching from the far side of the street. They were too heavy for anyone just out for a late-night stroll. I didn't look up immediately, fearing what I might see. When I finally did, he was there again, crossing over, heading straight for me. His face was half hidden by the brim of a battered baseball cap, but I could see his eyes now, cold, unblinking. I stood up abruptly, every muscle coiled tight with panic. The bus was still a few minutes away. No one else was around. I felt trapped. "Hey," he said, voice low and rough. No smile, no greeting, just the word hanging in the air like a challenge. "What do you want?" I managed, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tremor I felt. He stepped closer, and I could smell the faint, sour odor of sweat and cigarettes. "Just talking," he said, as if that made sense. I shook my head, hoping someone would come along, a car, a passerby, anything. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, edging back toward the street. He mirrored my movement, closing the distance. "Trouble's a matter of perspective. You're out here alone, late. Could be dangerous." I hated the way he said that, like he was warning me or mocking me at the same time. I scanned the street again, willing the bus to show up. The headlights appeared at the corner just then, a bright beam cutting through the night. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward the bus, my heart hammering so loud I was sure he could hear it. I climbed aboard, the warmth of the bus a stark contrast to the cold outside. The driver glanced at me but said nothing. I sat near the front, watching the door close behind me as the man stood on the sidewalk, still watching. The bus rolled away, leaving him standing alone in the night. I sank into my seat, trying to steady my breath, telling myself I had escaped. But something about his presence, the way he watched, told me this wasn't over. The bus hummed along the darkened streets, each mile pulling me further from the man's icy gaze, yet his silhouette still burned behind my eyes. Shadows stretched long across the cracked windows, twisting into shapes that seemed to leer and leer again. I gripped the edge of my seat, muscles taut, senses alert to every creak and groan of the aging vehicle. The driver's eyes flicked to me through the rearview mirror, a glint of something unreadable. I swallowed hard, realizing the night had only just begun to unravel, and whatever he wanted was not finished with me yet. His lips curled into a slow, chilling smile as the road ahead dissolved into darkness. The rain was steady but light when I left the diner that night, the kind that slickened the roads and made streetlights spill halos across the wet pavement. I'd been working the late shift at the graphic design firm downtown, an uneventful evening filled with stock photos and client emails, and the last thing on my mind was trouble. I felt drained and eager to get home, to peel off my wet jacket, and collapse on the couch with a stupid crime podcast. The bus stop was a block away, a small glass shelter with peeling paint and one flickering fluorescent tube that buzzed intermittently. I pulled my collar up against the damp and checked my phone. The next bus wasn't until after midnight. I slipped inside the shelter and sat down on the bench, the cold seeping in from the metal slats beneath me. The street was quiet except for the occasional swish of tires passing by. Most people were already home or at least off the streets. A man appeared from the corner of my eye, walking along the sidewalk toward me. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood up, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I noticed that his steps were uneven, a kind of wobble in his gait, like he was either drunk or injured. There was no one else around, and the rain was starting to pick up again, tapping rhythmically on the shelter's glass. I glanced up as he neared, my skin prickling despite the warmth of the jacket I wore. He stopped a few feet away, under a street lamp that flickered weakly, casting his face in shadow. He looked young, maybe early 20s, but there was something off about the way his shoulders hunched forward, like he was trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. His eyes caught mine for a moment, dark, unblinking, and I quickly looked down at my phone. The air tightened around me, and I realized I was holding my breath. When I dared to peek again, he was still standing there, but now his head tilted slightly, like he was studying me. The bus stop felt smaller, more enclosed, like the walls pressed inward. My fingers itched to grab my phone and call someone, but I told myself it was just a guy trying to wait out the rain, no harm intended. Minutes passed. The man didn't move, didn't say anything. I tried to focus on the podcast playing quietly through my earbuds, but the muffled voice of the host seemed distant, drowned out by the steady tapping of rain and the faint hum of the street lamp. The man shifted, just once, and in that motion, I caught the edge of something black peeking out from under his jacket, maybe a strap or a handle. My throat tightened. Then he started to walk alongside the shelter. "Hey," I said, pulling out an earbud, my voice shaky. "Do you need something?" He stopped again, just out of reach. "No," he said, voice low and a little rough. "Just waiting." I swallowed hard, glancing toward the street behind me where cars passed by, their headlights blurred by rain. The bus was still 15 minutes away. The man's eyes kept drifting to the street, then back to me, and I felt that same cold awareness. This wasn't just a coincidence. I stood up, folding my arms, trying to look confident even though my heart was thudding. "Okay," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm going to head home soon." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and moved a step closer. The rain had soaked through my jacket, making me shiver despite myself. My mind raced through the possibilities. If I left now, would he follow? Would he say something? Or worse, would he decide I was a target? I debated pulling out my pepper spray, but it was in my bag, buried deep beneath work papers and a half-eaten granola bar. The shelter's glass rattled as the wind picked up, making the whole place feel fragile, temporary. I looked at him again, noticing now the faint smell of cigarettes mixed with something else sour, like sweat or alcohol. His lips twitched, as if he were about to say something, but he only shook his head. The bus finally arrived, its headlights cutting through the night like a beacon. I stepped off the curb and onto the wet street, the sound of the engine loud in the enclosed space. The man lingered at the edge of the shelter, watching me. I kept my eyes fixed ahead as I climbed the steps and found a seat near the back. For several minutes, the bus rolled through the rain-drenched streets, the warmth inside a sharp contrast to the chill outside. I kept checking over my shoulder, heart hammering when I realized the man had boarded at the same stop. He sat a few rows in front of me, hoodie still up, staring out the window. I debated getting off at the next stop, but the thought of walking back alone in the rain felt worse. The bus wasn't crowded, just a few late-night travelers, an older woman dozing softly, a man with earbuds and a baseball cap turned backward, and the driver who hadn't looked in the rearview mirror once. After a few stops, the man got off, stepping into the rain without a word. Relief surged through me. I pulled my jacket tighter and tried to focus on the city lights flickering past the window. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he was just another person caught out in the weather. But as I looked down the street the bus had just passed, the one he disappeared into, I saw a figure pause under a streetlight, head tilted upward, watching. The bus rumbled on, and I sank into my seat, trying to steady my breathing. The night outside was dark and wet, and I realized that despite the temporary shield the bus provided, the city had pockets of quiet menace hidden in plain sight. Tonight, I had been lucky. For now, the bus was late. That was the first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the dim glow of the convenience store's automatic doors and into the cool early evening air. I glanced at my phone, 7:48 p.m., and the bus was supposed to be there 5 minutes ago. The empty street stretched ahead, the sidewalk flanked by shuttered storefronts and the occasional flickering street lamp. The neighborhood wasn't exactly the worst part of town, but after dark it felt hollow, like the city was holding its breath. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, though the air wasn't that cold. The wind was the kind that whispered, threading itself through the cracks in the buildings and making the shadows sway in a half-seen dance. I stepped up to the bus stop bench, the metal cold beneath my fingertips as I sat down. I wasn't in any rush, but I wanted to get home. Across the street, the bar's neon sign hummed a dull red. It flickered once and then steadied, casting an eerie glow on a group of people standing just outside the entrance. Most of them were laughing, faces blurry in the low light, but one man stood apart. He was tall, thin, and leaned against the wall, watching the street with a kind of stillness that felt out of place. I caught his eye for a second, and he didn't look away. His gaze was sharp, cold. I shifted on the bench, pulling my knees up against my chest. The bus stop had no shelter, just a single street lamp that buzzed softly overhead. The light was weak, barely pushing back the darkness pooling on the pavement. I could hear the distant rumble of traffic from the main road, but it felt muted, as if the night was swallowing sound along with light. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Did you get what you needed? I typed back a quick yes, thumb hovering over the screen for a moment before hitting send. Then I tucked it away, the glow from the screen suddenly too bright in the shadows. I tried to focus on the street again, but now I realized I wasn't alone. A man had appeared beside me at the bus stop. I hadn't heard him approach. He was maybe in his early 50s, scruffy beard, wearing a threadbare hoodie and jeans that looked like they'd been worn through years of hard work, or maybe neglect. He told me the time, 8:03 p.m., and then chuckled softly, glancing down the street as if expecting something to appear. I didn't respond. His eyes had a kind of dull desperation in them. The bus stop sign creaked as the wind picked up, rattling the metal pole. The man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, then asked if I was waiting for the bus too. I nodded, trying to keep my voice neutral. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "They're late tonight," he said. I told him I'd noticed. He started talking about how the buses had been running behind schedule all week. How the city was cutting corners, how no one cared anymore. His voice was low and rough, like gravel, and I found myself edging away on the bench, though there was nowhere else to go. "Where you headed?" he asked suddenly. "Home," I said, hoping he'd take the hint and leave me alone. He laughed again, but it was humorless. "That's a good place," he said. "Safe, right? For you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and strange. I forced a smile, but my throat had gone dry. I glanced down the street. No sign of the bus yet. Then I noticed the man's hands. One of them was gripping something small and metallic in his pocket. A keychain, maybe, or a knife. I didn't know, but the way his fingers curled around it made me uneasy. I stood up abruptly, my legs stiff from sitting. The man's eyes flicked up to me, and I saw something shift in his expression, something darker that hadn't been there before. He stepped closer. The street lamp buzzed louder, flickered, and for a moment the shadows behind him seemed to lean forward like long fingers. "Don't be like that," he said. "We're both just trying to get home." His voice was suddenly softer, but the smile was thinner, more like a warning. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The uneven pavement made it hard to find steady footing, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, wishing the bus would show up already. A sudden noise from behind, a clatter of a garbage can tipping over, made both of us snap our heads toward the alley beside the bus stop. A stray cat darted out, eyes shining in the dark before disappearing down the street. The man relaxed slightly, but the tension in the air didn't fade. "Funny how things change after dark," he muttered. The bus finally pulled up, its headlights cutting a glaring path through the gloom. I stepped forward without hesitation, pressing the button as I climbed aboard. The driver nodded at me, tired eyes behind the glass. As the doors closed, I looked back out at the street. The man was gone. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But as the bus pulled away, I caught sight of his silhouette standing beneath the bar's neon sign, watching me go. The city felt colder then, the night heavier. And I knew this wasn't the end. The bus rumbled forward, its engine a low growl beneath the city's restless hum. I sank into my seat, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the dark streets sliding past. Somewhere, just beyond the glow of the streetlights, that shadow waited, patient, relentless. I had never thought the morning commute could feel so isolating. The bus was nearly empty as I boarded, the usual chatter replaced by the soft hum of the heating system and the distant clatter of the driver shifting gears. It was just past 7, and the city hadn't quite woken up yet, the streets still slick with overnight rain that left a faint chemical scent mixed with exhaust hanging in the air. I took a seat near the back, window side, and watched the blurred shapes of early risers hurrying along the sidewalks. My phone buzzed once, an email notification, but I ignored it, pressing my forehead against the cold glass. The bus would take me halfway across town, then I'd switch trains to get near my office. The commute was usually uneventful, but lately I'd started feeling a knot in my gut I couldn't explain. The news had been saturated with stories of break-ins and muggings on the outskirts of the city, and though my route was mostly downtown and well-lit areas, I couldn't shake a vague, creeping unease. The bus stopped, and a man got on. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie zipped up to his chin, despite the temperature hovering just below 50 degrees. His face was shadowed, but I could tell his eyes scanned the bus with a slow, deliberate motion that made me uncomfortable. He didn't sit. Instead, he hovered near the front, leaning slightly against the driver's cabin, arms folded. Every so often, he would glance back toward me, and I caught his gaze just long enough to know it wasn't accidental. I shifted in my seat, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The bus jolted forward, and I tried to focus on the passing buildings, the flickering neon of a closed corner diner, the wet trees lining the boulevard. The man remained standing, his posture loose but rigid, like a predator waiting for the right moment. I debated moving closer to the driver, but the other seats were scattered and not inviting. Plus, I didn't want to give away my unease. As the bus rolled on, the man's phone buzzed twice. He pulled it out, glanced down, then stuffed it back in his pocket without a word. I wondered if he was texting someone or waiting for a message. His presence was like a weight pressing down on the entire bus. The few other passengers seemed oblivious, some with earbuds in, others staring at their phones or out the windows. Suddenly, the man took a step back and headed toward the middle of the bus. He stopped near me, though still standing, and leaned just slightly closer. His voice was low but clear. "Nice morning, huh?" I blinked. There was no smile, no warmth, just a flatness that made my skin crawl. "Yeah," I said cautiously, a bit chilly. He nodded once, then said, "You take this bus every day?" I hesitated. "Mostly." He tilted his head, as if considering something. "I'm new around here," he added. "Just trying to get to work." "Which part?" I found myself asking, partly to keep the conversation going and partly because I wanted to know if his route overlapped with mine. He shrugged. "Not far. Just a few stops ahead." The bus slowed at an intersection, the light turning yellow. Outside, a few pedestrians hurried past, faces hidden under umbrellas. The man's eyes flicked to mine again, sharper this time. "You live nearby?" he asked. "Not too far," I said. "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he shifted his weight and began scanning the bus again, slower this time, fingers drumming against his thigh. The moment stretched out, the hum of the engine the only sound between us. Finally, he said, "I'm looking for a place to crash tonight. You know, a spot that's safe." I swallowed, feeling a sudden, cold rush of adrenaline. The idea of a stranger asking for that so casually, so close, made my breath catch. "I'm sorry, I don't think I can help with that," I said, voice firmer than I intended. He smiled then. Not a friendly smile, but one that felt like a warning. "No worries," he said, stepping back. "Just thought I'd ask." The bus pulled into a busier stop, and more people got on. The man moved toward the front again, and I watched him, every instinct screaming at me to be alert. When the bus finally reached the transit center where I was supposed to transfer, I stood up quickly, gathered my bag, and moved toward the door. The man was still near the front, watching. As I stepped off, the cold air hit me harder than I expected, the rain having stopped but leaving the pavement slick and glistening. I pulled my collar up and started toward the train platform, glancing over my shoulder. The man was nowhere to be seen. Relief washed over me until I heard footsteps, steady and matching my pace. I looked again, and there he was, walking on the opposite side of the platform, eyes locked on me. The crowd was sparse, but I kept moving, weaving through the few other commuters. The train was late, announcing its arrival only moments after I reached the edge of the platform. I held my breath as I climbed aboard, choosing a seat in the middle car where there were more people. I dared a glance outside the window and saw the man standing still, watching the train pull away. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text. I didn't recognize the number. The message was simple. "I'm waiting." My fingers trembled as I locked the phone. The train's fluorescent lights flickered briefly, casting uneven shadows over the other passengers' faces. No one else seemed to notice anything amiss. I settled back, trying to steady my breathing. The ride would take another 20 minutes, and then I'd be in the city center, surrounded by crowds and cameras and noise. But the cold weight of that message pressed down on me like a stone. I'd never met this man before today. I had no idea why he was following me, or what he wanted. And that made the whole morning, the entire commute, feel like the start of something I wasn't sure I could control. The train lurched forward, and I stared out at the darkening city, every shadow suddenly alive with possibility. Story 5, Uninvited Presence Beyond the Locked Door. I never believed in burglars. Never thought I'd have to think twice about locking a door or double-checking windows before bed. My neighborhood was quiet, the kind where you left your porch lights on without worry and waved at the mailman as he passed. Yet, the night I found the stranger in my house, all that sense of safety unraveled like freight thread. It began with a sound soft enough to be dismissed, but persistent. I was sitting at my kitchen table, half-heartedly flipping through a magazine, the hum of the refrigerator the only steady noise. My apartment was on the second floor of an old brick building, the kind where every creak and groan seemed a little louder, a little more alive. At first, I thought it was the heater kicking on. But then the sound came again, a faint scraping, like nails drawing slowly across wood. I froze, the magazine slipping from my fingers. My eyes darted toward the living room. The overhead light was off, shadows pooling near the doorway where the hallway led to the bedrooms. A cold pulse throbbed at the base of my neck. I told myself it was nothing. Probably a branch brushing against the window or a loose shutter rattling in the wind. The rational part of me wanted to believe that, not the gnawing suspicion that something was wrong. I stood and moved slowly toward the hallway, each step measured and quiet. The scraping sound stopped abruptly. I reached the living room and glanced toward the front door. Locked and bolted, as always. The chain latch was intact. The windows, all shut tight. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing out of place. I should have called someone then. The police, a friend, anyone. Instead, I convinced myself I was imagining things, a trick of my tired mind. I told myself to go back to the kitchen and finish my tea. But before I could take a step, the unmistakable click of my bedroom door closing echoed from down the hall. My heart slammed against my ribs. I turned sharply, my breath catching. The door was closed, though I was sure I hadn't left it that way. From where I stood, I couldn't see inside, but the faintest shift of shadow behind the frosted glass panel suggested it was occupied. I swallowed hard, a sense of disbelief mingled with panic. Maybe I'd left it shut earlier. Maybe the wind had nudged it closed. But the quiet around me felt too deliberate, too charged with something I couldn't name. I debated calling out, but my voice caught in my throat. What would I say? Hello, I think there's someone in my bedroom? It sounded ridiculous. But how else to find out? I hitched forward, each step heavier than the last, trying not to make a sound. The air felt thick, suffocating even though the windows were cracked open a bit for the spring breeze. I reached the door and pressed my ear against the cool wood. Heart hammering, I listened. Silence. Not a breath, not a shuffle, nothing. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The bedroom was empty. The bed was made, the drawers closed, the small lamp on the bedside table switched off. My eyes scanned every corner, searching for something, anything that would explain the sound or the door closing. There was nothing. No one. I stepped in and closed the door behind me, the click unnerving in the stillness. My mind raced. Had I imagined it all? The noise, the door? I went to the window and looked out, half expecting to see someone lurking below, but the street was empty, bathed in the yellow glow of the street lamp. I left the window open and locked the door again, then headed back to the kitchen. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched settled deep in my bones. When my phone buzzed with a message from my friend Mark, I was grateful for the distraction. Hey, you still up? His text read. I stared at it for a moment before typing back that I was. He was my closest friend and the one person I could trust to help me think straight. I told him about the noise, the door, everything. His reply came almost immediately. Do you want me to come over? Sounds sketchy. I hesitated. The rational part of me urged yes, but I didn't want to admit I was scared. I told him no, that I probably just imagined it. He didn't push. After that, I tried to settle back into my chair, but my eyes kept darting toward the hallway. Every shadow seemed to shift just out of the corner of my vision. Every creak made me flinch. I kept my phone close, thumb twitching over the screen, ready to call for help. Then I heard it again. A soft, deliberate footstep from the hallway. Then another. I held my breath, frozen in place. The footsteps paused just outside the kitchen. I could see the faint outline of a figure through the frosted glass panel in the front door. The shape was tall, lean, unmoving. My mind screamed at me to run, to lock myself somewhere safe, but my body refused. The stranger lifted a hand and pressed it flat against the glass. I could see the fingers splay, the faint pulse of veins beneath pale skin. I backed away slowly, reaching for the cabinet where I kept a small knife for kitchen use. Not much, but better than nothing. The figure didn't move again. Just stood there, silent and still. I unlocked the front door, ready to bolt if I had to, but the stranger didn't enter. Instead, the person turned and disappeared down the stairs. The sound of footsteps faded, swallowed by the night. I locked the door again and slid to the floor, knife clutched tightly in trembling hands. I tried to tell myself it was over, that the stranger was gone. But as the night stretched on, and the silence grew heavier, I knew that the presence in my house wasn't just a visitor. It was something waiting, watching, and perhaps planning. I didn't sleep that night. The city's usual hum felt distant, my apartment a cage. Every shadow seemed to pulse with menace, every floorboard a potential threat. I thought about calling Mark again, but I didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, I sat there, knife in hand, waiting for the night to end. When dawn finally broke through the curtains, pale and hesitant, I realized that the stranger in my house had changed everything. My home was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. And I had no idea when, or if, that trap would spring. I didn't sleep that night. My bed felt like a trap, the thin sheet tangled around my legs as if it were trying to hold me there, to keep me from moving even while I wished to be anywhere else. The house was too quiet, too expectant. Every creak of the old wood, every subtle shift in the wall seemed magnified in the dark, and I was acutely aware of the spaces beyond my bedroom door. I kept imagining the presence I'd glimpsed earlier, the way the shadow moved beneath the hallway light, too tall and oddly stiff to be just a trick of the eye or a passing cat. By morning, a thin slit of pale sunlight was leaking through the curtains, but it offered little comfort. I stayed under the covers for a long time, convincing myself I'd imagined things. Maybe it had been a neighbor, or a delivery person who'd slipped in through the unlocked back door. The house was old, and it didn't lock properly, something I'd meant to fix but hadn't prioritized. Eventually, I forced myself out of bed. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet, a constant reminder that the house was alive in its own way, even without me. My phone was dead. I'd forgotten to charge it, and after the night I'd had, I didn't want to take the chance that the battery would die in the middle of a call for help. I needed to do something. I had to check the entire house. I started with the living room. The morning light made the place look less sinister, but the unease lingered. I scanned the furniture, the clutter, the windows. Everything seemed as I'd left it. The front door was still locked, the chains and deadbolt intact. But when I went to the back door, my heart skipped. The latch was slightly askew, the door not fully closed. I must have forgotten to lock it the night before. A cold knot twisted in my stomach. Whoever had been here had probably come in through this door. I stepped outside cautiously, looking around the backyard. It was overgrown with weeds, the garden long neglected, but there was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the damp soil, no broken branches or disturbed leaves. Yet, the back gate hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze, creaking on its rusted hinges. Closing the gate with a decisive thud, I tried to shake off the feeling that someone was watching me. I went back inside and locked the door firmly this time, testing the mechanism until it clicked securely. Then I checked the windows, every one closed and latched. Still, I had that nagging sense that something was wrong. I moved through the house methodically, room by room. The kitchen was clean, except for a cup I hadn't seen before, sitting on the counter. There was a faint lipstick stain on the rim. My throat tightened. I hadn't had any visitors in weeks. No one knew I was living here alone. I rinsed the cup without touching the rim, then put it away. The bathroom was fine, the bed unmade as I'd left it. But in the hallway mirror, I thought I saw movement behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. Only the empty corridor stretched back toward the bedrooms. A sudden noise, a faint scratching, like nails against wood, stopped me cold. It seemed to come from the basement door at the end of the hallway. My pulse quickened. I didn't want to go down there. The basement was dark and cramped, and I'd always felt uneasy about it, as if it held more than just old boxes and forgotten junk. But the noise came again, louder this time. I steeled myself, walked to the door, and reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, and my hand trembled as I turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the blackness below. I flipped the switch, and the single bulb flickered to life, casting weak yellow light on the concrete floor and the clutter within. There was nothing there. No one. Just old furniture covered in sheets, broken appliances, and stacked cardboard boxes. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. The scratching noise stopped, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible humming. It sounded mechanical, like a radio left on somewhere. I moved deeper into the basement, heart pounding. At the back, near the water heater, I found an old transistor radio lying face down. The humming was coming from it. I picked it up, but it had no batteries. How was it on? I dropped the radio and backed away, feeling a sudden chill wash over me. Then I noticed something else, a faint trail of wet footprints leading from the basement stairs to the back wall. The footprints were small and irregular, as if someone had been limping. I followed them carefully, and at the base of the wall, I found a loose panel. My hand shook as I pulled at it. The panel fell away, revealing a narrow crawl space, just wide enough to squeeze into. I shivered. Whoever had been in the house had been hiding down here. I debated what to do next. Call the police. But my phone was still dead. Neighbors were too far away to hear me if I screamed. And if the stranger was still here, I had no idea what they wanted or if they were dangerous. I closed the panel and sealed it as best I could. Then I went upstairs and locked the basement door behind me. I sat down at the kitchen table, trembling, trying to steady my breath. I kept thinking about the lipstick-stained cup, the unlocked back door, the footprints in the basement. It all pointed to someone who had been living in the house with me, unseen. I realized then that the stranger wasn't just passing through. They had been here for a while. Watching. Waiting. As the day wore on, I didn't leave the house. Every sound, every creak, every whisper of wind felt like a threat. I kept the lights on, drew the curtains tight, and kept a heavy kitchen knife close at hand. That night, I stayed awake again, the house settling around me with its ordinary noises, but I no longer believed in ordinary. Somewhere in the walls, in the shadows, I knew the stranger was still there. And I didn't know if I'd be able to get out of this alive. I spent the night staring at the door, waiting for the moment it would open again. Waiting for the stranger to step out of the darkness and into my life. The night had stretched thin, like a threadbare curtain barely holding back the darkness that had crept inside the house. I didn't sleep. Instead, I lay on the couch, my eyes fixed on the living room ceiling, where shadows formed strange, shifting shapes. Every so often, the sound of the wind scratching against the windows reminded me of how vulnerable I was. The house felt different now, strained, as if it were holding its breath alongside me. I kept replaying the night before in my mind, the faint creak in the hallway, the shadow slipping just beyond the corner of my vision, the sudden silence after the footsteps stopped. It had been impossible to shake the feeling that someone else was here, someone I hadn't invited in. But when I had checked every room, every closet, there was no one. Nothing but the usual clutter and the echo of my own footsteps. This morning, I was determined to find something definitive, some clue that could explain the presence I was sure I wasn't imagining. I moved through the house carefully, touching the backs of doors, peeking into cabinets, scanning every inch. Still, there was nothing. No sign of forced entry, no misplaced object, no forgotten bag or footprint in the dust. The house was pristine, as if no one had been inside but me. At noon, I left the house to run errands, locking the door behind me with a click that felt louder than usual. The streets were busy, filled with people going about their days, unaware of the secret I carried with me. I tried to focus on something mundane: groceries, the hum of traffic, the chatter in the cafe, but my mind kept drifting back to the house. I imagined the stranger pacing through my kitchen, touching the countertops, looking out through the windows. The thought twisted my stomach. When I returned, the house was exactly as I left it, silent and still. But something was off. The air inside felt colder, heavier. I pulled out my phone to check the time, and the screen flashed with a notification. A text message. I didn't recognize the number. "I'm here. Don't be afraid." My hands trembled as I stared at the message. I wanted to delete it, to convince myself it was some sick joke or a wrong number. But the words settled into my mind like a stone sinking into water. I spent the afternoon barricading the doors and windows as best I could, moving furniture in front of the entrances and pulling the curtains tight. I kept the phone close, fingers hovering over the screen in case the sender tried to reach me again. But there was nothing else. Only silence. As night fell, I tried to keep my nerves in check. I set up a few lamps, leaving them on in every room. The shadows seemed less menacing with the light, but the feeling of unease didn't dissipate. Instead, it grew, a silent pressure in the pit of my stomach. Around midnight, I thought I heard a noise from the basement, a slow, deliberate thump. I held my breath, listening. Then another. And another, steady and rhythmic, like footsteps pacing in the dark. I reached for the flashlight I kept by the couch and crept toward the basement door. My heart hammered, and my fingers trembled as I turned the knob. The basement was pitch black, the only light coming from the weak beam of my flashlight. The air smelled damp and musty. I swept the light around, but there was nothing there. No trace of movement, no sound except for the faint hum of the house settling. Suddenly, a cold breeze brushed past me, carrying with it a faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was mocking, almost amused. My flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my phone, turning on its light and shining it into the basement. That's when I saw it written in what looked like dirt smeared onto the concrete wall. "I'm watching." I stumbled backward, heart racing. The basement door slammed shut behind me. I scrambled to open it, my hand shaking violently, but it was locked tight. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, playful and cruel. I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady my breath. The phone's light illuminated the writing on the wall again, and I realized the message wasn't just a taunt, it was a promise. Hours later, I found the strength to call the police. They arrived quickly, searching the entire house and basement. They found no one, no sign of an intruder. The basement door was unlocked when they checked it, as if it had been all in my head. But I knew the truth. Someone had been there. I wasn't crazy. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the house. I needed to get away, to find safety. But even as I drove down the street, I felt the stranger's eyes on me, unseen but unyielding, following me wherever I went. The radio crackled with static, voices drowned beneath the hiss, but I caught a faint, distorted whisper, my name, drawn out and hollow. I slammed the brakes, heart pounding. The road ahead was empty, yet the air felt thick, alive with something unseen. Shadows twisted at the edge of my vision, slipping away whenever I tried to focus. No matter how far I drove, the feeling clung to me, a cold weight pressing from the darkness just beyond the headlights. I wasn't safe. Not yet. I woke up to a strange coldness in the room, the kind that seeps through the walls and settles in your bones. At first, I thought it was just the window left open, but when I reached over to shut it, my hand met resistance. There was something, a weight pressing against the glass. I froze, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. Outside, the moon was a pale smear behind the branches, and silhouetted against the glass was a figure standing perfectly still. I blinked and the figure vanished. For a moment, I sat there, breath shallow, trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the light or a shadow cast by a passing car. Then I heard it, the soft scrape of something heavy moving across the floorboards downstairs. It wasn't quite a footstep, more like the reluctant drag of a solid object. My throat tightened. I wasn't alone. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to listen. The house was otherwise deathly silent except for the occasional creak or groan of the old timber settling. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and crept toward the door. The hallway was dimly lit by the weak glow of the street lamp outside filtering in through the curtains. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. From somewhere below came the slow scrape again. I didn't have a phone on me, and the thought of calling for help made my stomach twist. Whoever it was might hear. I needed to stay quiet and figure out what was going on. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended slowly. Downstairs felt colder, the stale air thick with the scent of dust and something else, an acrid tang, like burnt rubber or plastic. The scrape came from the kitchen. It was rhythmic now, slow and deliberate, like something being pushed across the floor. I rounded the corner toward the kitchen doorway and froze. There, in the pale light streaming in from the street lamp, was the outline of a man. He was hunched over something on the floor. I couldn't make out his features clearly, but his movements were careful, precise. I swallowed, heart hammering. "Who's there?" I whispered, voice trembling. He snapped his head up abruptly, and for a brief second, I saw the wild eyes staring back at me. Then he took a step toward me, and I stumbled back, my foot catching the edge of the rug. The room seemed to tilt as I lost balance, and I heard a low growl from him. "Stay back," I said, voice firmer than I felt. "I'm calling the police." He hesitated, then turned and darted through the kitchen door into the back hallway. Without thinking, I followed, reaching for the light switch. The bulb flickered on, revealing the empty hallway and the closed door at the end that led to the basement. The man was gone. I stood there for a moment, trying to gather my breath. Was he really here? Had I imagined it? But the overturned chair in the kitchen and the strange smell left no doubt. I had an intruder. My mind raced. I had to get out, but the front door was on the other side of the house, and I wasn't sure if he was still inside. I crept back toward the living room, every sound amplified in the silence. As I passed the staircase, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The man was sliding down the stairs into the basement. I knew that basement was a locked-off space. At least, I thought I had locked it. I had never wanted to go down there. Now, the idea of that dark, musty room filled me with dread. The thought of him disappearing down into that black hole made my skin crawl. Then I heard the basement door creak open. I spun around, heart almost stopping. The man emerged into the hallway, carrying something in his arms. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but as the light hit it, I saw a small, shattered glass jar. Whatever it was, it had spilled its contents across the floor in a sticky, dark puddle. "Stop," I said, trying to sound firm, though my voice wavered. He tilted his head, an unnerving smile spreading across his face. "It's not yours," he said softly. The words didn't make sense, but I suddenly felt more terrified than ever. How did he know? What did he want? I backed away slowly, searching for my phone or anything to defend myself. My eyes landed on the fireplace poker leaning against the wall. Without thinking, I grabbed it and held it out in front of me. The man laughed, sharp and hollow. "You don't belong here," he said, taking another step toward me. I raised the poker, ready to swing if he came closer. The room felt smaller, the shadows pressing in around us. I could barely breathe. Suddenly, I heard sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. The man hesitated, then bolted toward the front door. I chased after him, heart pounding, but he was faster. He slipped out just before the police arrived. I was left standing on the porch, shaking, trying to explain what had happened. They took my statement and searched the house, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing but the shattered jar on the kitchen floor. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that stranger's wild eyes watching me from the shadows. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment I closed the front door behind me, the silence felt heavier, thick like a blanket wrapped too tight, muffling every sound I made. I stood in the hallway, my keys still in my hand, staring at the dim glow filtering through the cracked blinds in the living room. The house should have smelled like the faint trace of my lavender air freshener or the lingering aroma of last night's dinner, but instead, a cold, stale odor hung in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Something was wrong. I dropped my keys onto the bowl by the door and stepped inside, the soles of my shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor. My breath hitched when I noticed the faint scuff marks on the floor near the entrance, small but clearly recent. Whoever was here before me had left in a hurry or had been careful enough to avoid making more noise, but not careful enough to cover every trace. In the kitchen, the window was cracked open just a hair, letting in a breeze that fluttered the thin curtains. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I moved toward it cautiously, my heart starting to pound, not in the usual way that excitement would make it, but that cold, sinking beat of alarm that something was terribly wrong. I closed the window and locked it, my fingers trembling. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, the seconds dragging painfully slow as if mocking my rising dread. I didn't want to call anyone yet. Calling the police felt too final, too exposing, like admitting I was a victim. Besides, I wasn't sure if I was even safe enough to stay here anymore. Retracing my steps, I headed into the living room. The couch was where I'd left it, but the cushions had been disturbed, the subtle indentation I knew I'd made gone. Someone had sat there. Someone had been here. I sat down heavily, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself I was imagining things. That maybe I'd been too tired, too paranoid. But when I glanced toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms, a shadow shifted just beyond the corner of my vision. I blinked hard, and it was gone. No one was supposed to be here. No one should be. The bedroom door was closed, and I reached for the handle, hesitating for a moment. Part of me wanted to barricade myself in there, lock the door, and wait for daylight. But I had to know if my things were still intact. If I was truly alone. I pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the moonlight spilled through the window, casting long, eerie shapes across my bed and dresser. But the dresser drawer was slightly ajar, something I was certain I hadn't left that way. I knelt down, my fingers brushing over the drawer handle, and pulled it open fully. Inside, my jewelry box lay overturned, its contents scattered across the floor. Rings, necklaces, small trinkets, everything out of place, like someone had been searching for something specific. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. I gathered the pieces, my hands shaking, and stuffed them back inside, slamming the drawer shut. I didn't hear anything beyond the usual rustling of the wind against the window, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I forced myself to check the other rooms, bathroom, spare bedroom, even the basement door. All were undisturbed, locked, or empty. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I moved back to the living room and glanced at the phone on the side table. Maybe it was time to call someone. Anyone. My fingers hesitated over the screen. Then, the lights flickered once, twice, before plunging the room into darkness. I froze. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the hallway just as a door creaked open slowly at the far end. I swallowed hard and stepped forward, the light trembling in my grip as I shined it down the hallway. Nothing but empty rooms stared back. I exhaled shakily and turned back toward the living room, heart still thudding. Then, the phone vibrated in my hand. A message. No name. No number. Just 3 words. I'm inside, still. Every muscle in my body tensed. I wanted to scream, to run, to call the police, but I couldn't move. I was trapped in a nightmare that felt all too real. The silence returned, oppressive and suffocating. I didn't know what to do next, except to wait, listen, and hope that whoever was in my house would leave before I had to face them. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't. My breath hitched as I slid the phone into my pocket, every shadow in the room suddenly alive with menace. The old floorboards creaked somewhere behind me, slow and deliberate, like footsteps pacing just out of sight. I strained to listen, nothing but the steady tick of the clock and my own ragged heartbeat. A cold sweat spread across my skin. I wanted to call for help, but what if they heard? What if this was some sick game, and the second I made a sound, they'd be on me? I edged toward the door, hand trembling as I reached for the knob, then stopped. The faintest whisper brushed past my ear, too soft to catch words, but enough to freeze my blood. I swallowed my terror and whispered back, "Who are you?" Silence. Then, a slow, chilling reply, "Not who." What? Story 6, Carnival of Broken Dreams. I never meant to go back there. Of all the places I could have chosen for that night walk, the abandoned theme park wasn't anywhere near the top of the list. But when your friends dare you with a smirk and a shaky voice, and your phone dies just as the last bus leaves town, options become limited. I should have just called a cab, or even walked the long way home down the empty streets, but the park loomed there like a dark promise on the edge of the neighborhood, and something about its silent decay pulled me in. The gates were rusted shut, chains twisted and knotted like old wounds. I circled until I found a weak spot near the old ticket booth, where the glass was cracked and spiderwebbed from years of neglect. The lock was fragile, and with a few hard nudges, the chain gave way with a reluctant creak that echoed into the night. I hesitated for a moment, then slipped inside, the air immediately thick with the smell of mildew and rust. The park had been closed for nearly a decade. I'd been a kid the last time it was open, with its bright colors and cheerful music seeping through the summer air like a promise of endless fun. Now, all of that was gone, replaced by shadows and silence. The carousel, once the heart of the park, stood still. Its paint peeled and faded, the horses frozen in mid-gallop with glassy eyes staring into nothingness. I stepped closer, the wooden boards creaking under my boots as I tried to imagine it spinning, the lights flickering, the laughter of children ringing out. I pulled out my phone despite its dead battery, mostly for the flashlight, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted metal frames of roller coasters that reached up to the cloudy sky like skeletal arms. The wind pushed through the empty paths, carrying with it the faintest hint of something else, an acrid scent, like burnt fabric mixed with stale smoke. I told myself it was just the park settling, or the remnants of some long-ago accident. As I wandered deeper, every step seemed to stir the silence, making it heavier. The shadows cast by the broken lights danced erratically, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The rust on the rides had eaten into the metal, sharp edges glinting like broken teeth. I traced my fingers over the cold steel of a bumper car, imagining the chaos it once hosted, the thrill of crashing and laughing. Now there was only stillness and something else. The funhouse caught my eye next. Its facade was a warped mess of mirrors, many shattered, reflecting fragments of the dark sky and my own distorted face. I approached cautiously. The door was ajar, hanging on one hinge. Something about the way the shadows pulled inside made me pause. I debated turning back, but the stubborn part of me wanted to see inside, to prove to myself that it was just an empty shell, nothing more. I stepped through and immediately the temperature dropped. The stale air inside was thick with dust and something metallic, like blood. The beam of my flashlight flickered erratically as I moved forward, casting long, uncertain shadows. The mirrors on the wall showed me in pieces my eyes, a sliver of my smile, a hand reaching out. Then I saw it, a faint smear on one mirror, dark and sticky, too irregular to be just dirt. Heart pounding, I moved closer. The smear looked fresh, oddly out of place among the years of grime. I tried to rationalize it, a bird, maybe, or some sap from a tree outside blown in by the wind. But then I heard it, the softest shuffle from deeper within the funhouse, something too deliberate to be random. I froze, listening. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer, just a flutter of wind through broken windows and the distant creak of metal. I told myself to turn back, to leave before my imagination ran away with me. But as I took a step toward the exit, a cold breath brushed past the back of my neck. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. No one. I forced a laugh, the sound hollow and unconvincing. Reason told me I was alone, the park was abandoned. Maybe the wind had shifted, or maybe I'd imagined the breath altogether. Still, a part of me wanted to get out, to feel the safe night air again. I turned and hurried back toward the entrance, the funhouse swallowing my retreating silhouette. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the rusted signs and sending leaves swirling across the cracked pavement. I paused near the carousel once more, the moonlight catching the chipped paint and casting long shadows. I reached out to touch one of the horses again, and this time, the glassy eye seemed to catch the light differently, almost as if it flickered with a spark of life. I blinked, shaking off the feeling. I was tired, probably too much caffeine and not enough sleep. I just needed to get home. But as I looked around, the park felt different, less like a forgotten playground and more like a trap closing in. I took a deep breath and started walking back to the gate. The chains were where I'd left them, the lock dangling loose but intact. I pulled on the gate, but it wouldn't budge. Confused, I tried again. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift with a faint tremor, and a distant sound, a low, grinding noise, started up beyond the trees, somewhere near the old roller coaster. I swallowed hard and stepped back. The park wasn't as empty as I thought. Something was moving out there, lurking just beyond sight, waiting. I didn't wait to find out what. I ran. The gates scraped as I pushed against them, the wind howling in my ears as the grinding noise grew louder, more insistent. Finally, the chain snapped free, and I stumbled out onto the cracked sidewalk, gasping for air. The cold night embraced me, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. But as I glanced back once more, the carousel's horses seemed to turn their heads ever so slightly, their glass eyes following me into the darkness. The sun had barely risen by the time I found myself standing in front of the rusted gates of Blackwood Amusement Park. The heavy metal was warped and scratched, with faded posters peeling away like forgotten memories beneath layers of grime. The lock that should have secured the entrance was shattered, hanging loosely on one hinge, inviting anyone reckless enough to wander inside. I had to admit, the place was more haunting than I had imagined. The air was thick with neglect and something else I couldn't quite identify, a coldness that bit at my skin despite the warmth of the early morning. The usual chirping of birds was absent, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in from all sides. It felt like the park was holding its breath. I glanced around nervously. The cracked pavement beneath my boots was littered with broken glass and dried leaves, crunching underfoot as I pushed the gate open, its screech echoing down the deserted midway. No signs of recent visitors, no footprints besides my own. Just an empty, decaying playground frozen in time. As I stepped inside, I caught sight of the ticket booth to my left. The glass was shattered, shards scattered on the floor amid discarded pamphlets yellowed with age. The wooden counter was splintered, and inside, an old cash register sat half open, its innards exposed like a wound. I crouched down, picking up one of the pamphlets. The date printed on it read 1998, 22 years ago. That matched the rumors I'd heard. The park had been shut down overnight after a series of mysterious accidents. I stuffed the pamphlet in my pocket and moved deeper into the park, my heartbeat quickening with each step. The roller coaster loomed ahead like a skeletal beast, its tracks rusted and twisted, some sections missing altogether. I could just make out the wooden supports as they groaned softly in the morning breeze, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Something about the place was wrong. It wasn't just the silence or the decay. It was the way shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, the subtle creaks seeming to come from places that should have been still. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the product of my imagination and the stories I'd heard. I decided to explore the carousel first, hoping to find some clues about what happened here. As I approached, the faded colors of the painted horses caught my eye, once bright and cheerful, now chipped and dull. The platform was covered in grime, with weeds pushing up through the cracks beneath. One of the horses was missing its head, lying a few feet away like a silent warning. I ran my fingers over the aged wood. It was strangely smooth in places, as though someone had been there recently. But the rest of the park looked untouched. How could that be? I was about to turn away when I heard it, the faintest creak, like the carousel shifting under a gentle weight. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I looked around, half expecting to see someone, but the midway was empty. I told myself it was just the breeze, or perhaps the fractured hydraulics still attempting to move after all these years. But the sound had come again, sharper this time, accompanied by a low groan that seemed almost human. My skin crawled. I decided it was time to move on, heading towards the central plaza where the old fountain stood. The fountain was cracked and dry, vines creeping inside its basin like grasping fingers. As I circled it, I noticed graffiti scrawled along the stone, names, dates, and unsettling symbols I couldn't decipher. Then I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a movement near the shadow of the Ferris wheel. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. Just the creaking of the giant wheel as it swayed with the wind. I was about to dismiss it as a trick of light when a soft tapping echoed from the direction of the funhouse. My heart pounded. The funhouse had always been the park's centerpiece of terror and delight, but now it was a crumbling shell, its mirrors shattered and walls covered in graffiti. I hesitated, the need to uncover the truth battling against the instinct to flee. But curiosity won. As I approached the entrance, the air grew colder, and I noticed the faint scent of something metallic, old rust, maybe blood. My flashlight beam danced over the warped doorway, where a faded sign read, "Enter if you dare." I stepped inside. The darkness swallowed me instantly, and my footsteps echoed down the narrow corridor. Mirrors lined the walls, many cracked and spider-webbed with fractures. The reflections were distorted, twisting my image into something grotesque. I shone the light ahead and saw a narrow path winding deeper into the funhouse's bowels. The tapping continued, now rhythmic and deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I moved forward, each step heavier than the last. The temperature dropped further, breath misting in the beam of my flashlight. Then, almost imperceptibly, I heard a whisper too faint to catch the words, but filled with urgency. A wave of nausea swept over me, and I shook my head to clear it, forcing myself onward. I rounded a corner and suddenly stopped. The corridor opened into a large room filled with broken carnival props and shattered glass. The tapping stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a weight. Then I saw it. A small figure crouched in the shadows, a child, or at least it looked like one, with tangled hair and dirty clothes. The figure didn't move but stared directly at me, eyes reflecting my flashlight like dark pools. I called out softly, "Hey, are you okay?" No response. I took a step closer, heart hammering in my chest, and the figure suddenly bolted, disappearing through a broken wall into the darkness beyond. I hesitated, debating whether to follow, but something in the air told me to stop. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I decided to retrace my steps, eager to leave the funhouse behind. As I exited, a sudden crash echoed somewhere deep inside the building. I spun around, flashlight swinging wildly, but all I saw was emptiness. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, but the park remained unchanged, a decaying monument to forgotten joy and hidden horrors. I realized then that whatever had shut down Blackwood Amusement Park had not left. It was still here, lurking beneath the rust and rot, waiting. And I had just scratched the surface. The sky was beginning to bleed that dull, hollow shade of twilight when I finally settled in the decaying control booth of the Ferris wheel. I hadn't intended to stay there long. I just wanted a moment to catch my breath and think. But the rusted bolts in the wheel groaned unsettlingly every time a gust of wind passed, as if the whole structure was groaning in protest of being left to rot. The booth's glass was cracked in several places, smearing the sinking light into fractured beams that played tricks on my eyes. I took out my flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom and illuminating the creeping ivy clutching the metal frame like some living thing. I kept hearing it, that low hum beneath the silence, a vibration in the air itself, soft but persistent, like a distant engine idling or the murmuring of someone just beyond sight. At first, I convinced myself it was simply the wind threading its way through twisted metal, but the pattern was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I tried to focus on the sound, and that's when I noticed the shadows were moving differently beneath the wheel's spokes. They weren't just the shifting remnants of fading daylight. Something was altering their shape, creeping and pooling like dark oil. I swallowed hard. The thrill I'd felt earlier, that flicker of excitement about exploring the park's forgotten corners, was now a distant ember smothered by unease. The stories about this place crept into my mind, the disappearances, the sudden closure, the whispered rumors of a tragedy nobody talked about anymore. Until now, I dismissed them as urban legend, the kind of folklore that clings to abandoned places to warn off trespassers. But standing in that booth, surrounded by peeling paint and the cold bite of rust, the stories felt far too real. The gravel underfoot crunched sharply, a sound so out of place that I froze. My breath hitched, and I scanned the area with my flashlight. Nothing moved, yet the sound echoed again, this time closer, as if someone or something was pacing around the base of the wheel. I fought the urge to run, reminding myself to stay calm, to think rationally. It had to be an animal or maybe another trespasser. But I knew deep down that this park wasn't just empty. Then, a scraping noise came from the inside of the booth. Slow, deliberate. Like nails striking across the metal panel beside me. I whipped my flashlight around, but there was nothing there. The beam trembled slightly in my shaking hand. I told myself it was probably just a loose piece of metal, shifting under the wind. But the sound came again, louder this time, and the booth's cracked glass rattled as though something was tapping on it from the outside. My pulse hammered in my ears. I debated whether to call out, but the dry, suffocating silence of the park crushed the sound before it left me. Instead, I crept to the window, pressing my face against the jagged glass to peer out. The ground seemed deserted, cast in long, creeping shadows. I couldn't see what had made the noise, but a sudden chill swept through me, not entirely from the cold. Without warning, the Ferris wheel jolted. The entire structure shuddered, groaning louder, and I stumbled backward, heart in my throat. The wheel moved slowly at first, as though powered by some unseen force, then faster, more violently. I scrambled to the door, fumbling with the rusted lock, but it stuck. Panic rose like bile in my chest. Why was the wheel moving? There was no power, no one to operate it. And yet, it spun, as if to life from an ancient slumber. I ripped at the lock until it gave way with a metallic snap. I stumbled out onto the platform, the wheel's motion throwing me off balance. In the growing darkness, the cabins swung like pendulums, their shadows flickering grotesquely against the booth's walls. I forced myself to look upward, chasing the wheel's rotation. At the top, in a cabin silhouetted against the bleeding sky, I saw a figure. It was hunched over, motionless, but unmistakably human. My breath caught. Was it some other wanderer? Or something else? The cabin creaked as it swung, and the figure shifted, a slow tilt of the head that sent a cold shiver down my spine. I blinked, and it was gone. The wheel slowed, grinding to a stop with a final shudder that echoed through the park like a dying heartbeat. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, my footsteps pounding against the cracked concrete, heart hammering as I fled from the wheel's looming shadow. Behind me, the park seemed to sigh, the oppressive silence returning with a suffocating weight. I didn't stop until I reached the narrow path leading to the park's exit. The chain-link gate was locked, but I spotted the side fence, bent and broken near the overgrown bushes. I squeezed through, dirt and scratch marks tearing at my clothes and skin. I could feel eyes watching me, but when I looked back, there was nothing. Just the dark skeleton of the Ferris wheel, standing silently against the night. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, replaying every detail, every sound, every shadow. The park wasn't just abandoned, it was waiting. Waiting for something, or someone. And I was certain now that I hadn't been alone there. Not really. But what I didn't understand then, what I only realized later, was that some things never truly leave places like that. They don't fade with rust and time. They linger, tethered to the broken rides and crumbling facades, haunting the spaces between memory and nightmare. And once you've seen them, there's no going back. The next day, I tried to tell myself that what I'd seen was a trick of the light, a product of exhaustion and fear. I scoured the news and local forums for any mention of another trespasser or park employee. Nothing. No reports, no sightings, no explanations. The park had been sealed off for years, and nobody was supposed to be inside. But I knew the truth, I'd been inside. And whatever was in that cabin, watching me, was still there. Watching. Waiting. The sun was dipping low behind the skeletal frames of the abandoned park, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the cracked pavement. I hadn't expected to be out here this late, but curiosity and the need to find something, anything that would explain the strange things I'd seen, had pushed me deeper into the ruins. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay, a sharp contrast to the faint scent of popcorn and cotton candy that still seemed to hang, faintly, in my memory from childhood visits to theme parks long gone. The main entrance was behind me now, swallowed by twilight and the encroaching weeds that clawed through every crack. I had wandered past the carousel, where the horses stood frozen mid-gallop, their paint faded and chipped, eyes staring blankly into nothingness. I had to remind myself these rides were no longer a source of joy. They were monuments to something that had gone terribly wrong. My flashlight cut through the growing darkness, the beam bouncing off twisted metal and shattered glass. Around me, the silence was almost a physical presence, pressing against my ears. I felt like I was being watched, but every time I spun around, there was nothing but the empty traces of fun long since lost. I remembered the map taped to the inside of the park's main office, which I'd found earlier that afternoon. The place was a wreck, papers strewn about, desks overturned, and the faint smell of mildew, but the map was mostly intact. It showed the layout of the park, and I had marked the spots where I'd noticed the most unusual damage or signs of recent activity. Now, with night falling, I focused on one particular area, the funhouse. The place had been boarded up, but something about it pulled me in. The path to the funhouse was overgrown, the once bright signs faded to ghostly outlines. I pushed through a curtain of vines and stumbled onto the cracked concrete porch. The door hung crooked on its hinges, groaning softly in the breeze. I hesitated, the cold creeping up my spine as I shined my light inside. Darkness swallowed the interior, but I could make out the warped mirrors and twisted corridors that twisted like a labyrinth. The air smelled musty, with a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath my boots. As I moved deeper, the beam from my flashlight caught reflections in the warped glass. At first, they distorted my image, elongated limbs, stretched faces, but then I noticed something that made me freeze. In one of the mirrors, behind my reflection, I thought I saw a shadow move independently, a figure that didn't match my position. I spun around, heart hammering, but the hall was empty. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a trick of exhaustion and adrenaline. But the chill in the air told me otherwise. I pressed on, moving cautiously through the funhouse's maze. The walls seemed to close in around me, the distorted images in the mirrors now swimming, rippling like water. I caught glimpses of shapes lurking just beyond the lights, reached dark, formless, but unmistakably alive. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something crouched in the corner of a room. It was small, hunched over, its outline blurred and indistinct. I called out, my voice trembling, but only silence answered. When I looked again, it was gone. I felt a sudden drop in temperature, my breath fogging in the stale air. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I was plunged into darkness. When the light steadied, I saw writing scrawled across one of the walls in what looked like dried blood. The words were smeared, but I could make out, "Don't leave." A knot tightened in my stomach. I no longer felt like I was the one exploring the park, it felt like something else was watching me, toying with me. I debated turning back, but a stubborn part of me wanted to understand what had happened here, what had caused this place to rot so completely. I moved on, the path winding tighter, the laughter of long-gone children echoing faintly in my ears, or maybe it was just my imagination. The exit was nowhere in sight, and the corridors seemed to loop back on themselves, trapping me in a maze that had no end. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping, coming from somewhere ahead. I froze, listening as the tapping grew louder, echoing off the warped mirrors. It was rhythmic, like someone knocking on wood. I called out again, but there was no response, only the relentless tapping. I edged closer, the beam of my flashlight revealing a small door, half hidden behind a curtain of cobwebs. The tapping seemed to come from behind it. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, cold sweat slicking my palm. The door gave way with a creak, revealing a cramped room bathed in shadows. In the center sat an old music box, its lid slowly opening and closing as the source of the tapping. The air around it was thick, oppressive, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't comprehend. I leaned in, and the music box began to play a haunting, warped melody that tugged at something deep inside me. The mirrors around the room shimmered, and for a brief second, I saw faces, dozens of them, pressed against the glass, mouths open in silent screams. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, the music box clattering shut. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that filled the space like a suffocating fog. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned on my heel and ran, the maze of the funhouse twisting and turning, trying to trap me. Outside, the night was thick and cold, but it was freedom compared to the nightmare inside. As I burst into the open air, my breath ragged, I realized the park wasn't just abandoned, it was alive. Not in the way the rides used to be, but in a darker, more malevolent sense. It was watching, waiting. And I had just become part of its story. The air inside the funhouse was thick with a stale, sour smell, part mildew, part rusted metal, part something I couldn't quite identify. The flickering light bulb above the entrance threw uncertain shadows that danced and stretched along the warped mirrors lining the narrow corridor. Each distorted reflection seemed to mock me with 1,000 fractured images of my own nervous posture and pale face. I took a breath and stepped inside. I never imagined a place once so full of laughter and joy could decay into something so unnerving. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of the building settling and the occasional drip of water from somewhere deep inside. My footsteps echoed hollowly on the warped wooden floorboards, their groans a reminder that this place was still alive in its own twisted way. The hallway narrowed and twisted, forcing me to turn sharply into another room. The mirrors here were cracked wide, splintered like spider webs, reflecting shards of darkness rather than light. I stopped to look at one, my face fragmented into jagged pieces, and noticed someone in the corner behind me. I spun around quickly, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. I tried to tell myself my eyes were playing tricks, the mind's way of turning shadows into threats. But the unease clung to me like a second skin. Further down the corridor, a door creaked open slowly, as if pushed by a breeze. The sound was soft, almost polite, but it shattered the silence like a gunshot. I froze. The hallway felt suddenly colder, my breath forming white clouds in the dim light. I wanted to run, but curiosity, stubborn and foolish, pulled me forward. Inside the room was a small arcade, long stripped of its machines. The empty cabinets stood like hollow shells, their screens smeared with dust and grime. The floor was littered with shattered glass and scraps of faded, brittle posters. One poster, half torn but still legible, showed a clown with a wide, painted grin and eyes that somehow seemed too real. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath me. Then I saw it, something small and dark moving among the debris. I crouched, squinting through the gloom. It was a rat. A rat, and nothing more. I exhaled sharply, the tension easing just a fraction. Then the lights flickered again. For a moment, I thought I heard laughter, soft, distant, distorted. It wasn't the childlike giggle I'd expected, but a low, gurgling chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned toward the direction of the sound, but there was only silence. I forced myself to move on. The funhouse had to have an exit somewhere, and I needed to find it before the cold seeped any deeper into my bones. The corridor led me to a stairwell, its peeling paint and rusted railing evidence of long neglect. I climbed cautiously, each step protesting under my weight. At the top, a narrow platform overlooked the park grounds below, now little more than a wilderness reclaimed by nature. The Ferris wheel skeletal frame loomed in the distance, motionless and creaking softly in the wind. From my vantage point, I saw movement near the carousel, something or someone crouched among the broken horses. My heart slammed against my ribs. I raised my flashlight, shining the beam across the clearing, but the figure vanished before my eyes landed on it. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow shifted by the swaying trees. Yet the growing dread in my chest wasn't so easily dismissed. With no other choice, I climbed down and made my way toward the carousel. The grassy clearing was overgrown with weeds, and the horses were cracked and faded, their once bright colors dulled and worn. I reached out to touch one, its chipped paint rough against my fingertips. Suddenly, a sharp metallic sound rang out behind me, a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. I whipped around, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but saw nothing. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I started walking briskly toward the main entrance of the park, hoping to find an exit or at least a path that didn't feel like it was closing in on me. The wind picked up, rustling dead leaves and whistling through the hollow remains of the ticket booths. A low moan drifted on the wind, subtle but unmistakable. I stopped dead, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, like someone or something was breathing heavily just beyond the tree line. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I forced myself to keep moving, faster now, each step a battle between terror and the need to escape. As I rounded a corner near the Ferris wheel, I tripped over something in the underbrush. Falling forward, I caught myself just before hitting the ground. My flashlight skittered across the dirt and came to rest on a twisted, broken piece of doll's face half buried in mud, one glassy eye staring blankly upward. I swallowed hard and scrambled back to my feet. The heavy breathing was closer now, a rasping, ragged sound that made my skin crawl. I shone the light into the shadows, but saw only darkness and the swaying branches. Then the breathing stopped. An unbearable stillness settled over the park, thick and suffocating. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if a predator was watching me from just beyond the veil of night. I forced myself to keep moving, edging closer to the entrance gates. They stood rusted and chained, locked tight, but behind them I could see the faint glow of streetlights, freedom, or at least the promise of it. I reached the gates and tried the chain. It held fast, but the lock looked old, vulnerable. I grabbed a loose rock and smashed it against the padlock. It shuddered, then gave way with a clatter. My heart leapt. I pushed the gates open, stepping onto the cracked pavement of the street beyond. The breathing began again, low and guttural, but now it was behind me, fading into the distance as I sprinted away from the nightmare of the park. I didn't look back until I was safe under the streetlights, the park swallowed once more by darkness behind me. The twisted echoes of abandoned laughter still haunted my ears, but I was out. For now. But I knew I hadn't escaped entirely. Whatever had been there in the funhouse, whatever watched from the shadows, it wasn't done with me yet.